This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. The sun has been very hot on my head and made me as in a fire. But now I have come into this valley and drunk of these waters and washed myself in them, and they have cooled me. Now that I am cool, I have come with my hands open to you to live in peace with you. I speak straight and do not wish to deceive or be deceived. When God made the world, he gave one part to the white man and another to the Apache. Why was it? Why did they come together? Now that I am to speak, the sun, the moon, the earth, the air, the waters, the birds and beasts, even the children unborn shall rejoice at my words. The white people have looked for me long. I am here. They have looked for me long. Why am I worth so much? If I am worth so much, why not mark when I set my foot and look when I spit? I am no longer chief of all the Apaches. I am no longer rich. I am but a poor man. The world was not always this way. When I was young, I walked all over this country, east and west, and saw no other people than the Apaches. After many summers, I walked again and found another race of people had come to take it. How is it? Why is it that the Apaches wait to die, that they carry their lives on their fingernails? The Apaches were once a great nation. They are now but few. I have no father or mother. I am alone in the world. No one cares for Cochise. That is why I do not care to live and wish the rocks to fall on me and cover me up. I want to live in these mountains. I do not want to go to Tularosa. That is a long ways off. The flies on those mountains eat out the eyes of the horses. The bad spirits live there. I have drunk of these waters and they have cooled me. I do not want to leave here. Cochise in 1871 on why he did not want to relocate to New Mexico. Cochise, the son-in-law to Mangus Coloradus, the chief of the Chokonin Chiricahua Apache, the star of the White Eyes Nightmares, the bringer of death and destruction upon the American Southwest. Cochise will feature heavily in this episode as we follow his exploits throughout this region and this era, right up until his death. But he is not the only player. General Crook, Bourke, many a bureaucrat, the Tonto Apache, the Yavapai, and the red-haired kidnapped Felix, a.k.a. Mickey Free, they will all also make lengthy and exciting appearances. Saddle up, and let's continue to ride into this saga of the Apache in the American Southwest. The Camp Grant Massacre, as we are about to see, will have far-reaching consequences for both the White Eyes and the Apache. But there are other groups in the area as well. And they too had to eventually come to peace with the Apache. Peace, or war to the knife, even war to the death, as Victoria will later exclaim. One of those groups was the O'odham, sometimes called the Pima or the Papago. Some of them, the Tohono O'odham, they had participated in the massacre, One of their warriors with the ironwood club was featured on the cover of the last episode. Well, after the massacre, the surviving Apaches and the O'odham, aka Pima and Papagos, they all met near Camp Grant to smooth things over. This meeting occurred in May of 1872, and it saw the two groups come together for an extended face-to-face meeting, which was an incredibly rare circumstance, a circumstance that few living O'odham or Apache had ever witnessed. At the meeting, though, the translator, an O'odham man named Louis Morago, he was greeted happily by an Apache that recognized him. This Apache man had been knocked unconscious by the deadly ironwood club which belonged to Morago. And this had happened in a raid by the O'odham on the Apache years before. This Apache man told the translator, quote, "You are the Pima who killed me years ago." End quote. Old wounds can heal after all. Once the meeting had commenced, the O'odham made a bunch of speeches about peace, and then an Apache chief, Santos, he laid a rock on the ground and said essentially, "Our peace will last as long as this rock." To this display, the O'odham chief, Galarita, he had also participated in the massacre. He said, quote, "If you Apaches will comply with your promises, I will never tread your soil again with evil intentions. If I have done so in the past, it was because I was provoked by your robbing." End quote. Everyone. It becomes clear when learning about the Apaches, everyone is eventually provoked into murder by Apache robbing, aka violent raiding. Galarita goes on to say, quote, "We are friends. If you want to come to Tucson, do so, and you can traffic with us and visit us without fear." End quote. By October of that year, though, 1872, only 5 months after the parley, the O'odham were again asking the U.S. Army to help them in their fight against the Apache, who, it seems, broke promises with the O'odham as easily as they did with the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the White Eyes. At this meeting were two men I will talk a lot about in this episode. Those men are General Crook and General Howard. They play an enormous role in the continuation of the saga of the Apache in the American Southwest. And this meeting will be mentioned again later as well. Quick aside about the O'odham, though. At this time, the whites, and especially the Mormons, were flooding into their lands and diverting their waters with dams and aqueducts, which left the O'odham people with barren and parched fields of agriculture. Life became rather difficult for these harsh desert people. On top of that, the Mormons and their Anglo settlers made deals with the O'odham who were forced to move closer to cities just to survive. They made these deals with the Indians in the hopes that the O'odham would be a buffer between their Anglo settlements and the increasing violence of the Apache. But this would only lead to more violence amongst and between the O'odhams themselves. Fights, shootings, and Tiz-Win-Bender violence shook the O'odham lands at the same time that the Apache wars were beginning in earnest to their north and east. The O'odham will no longer play a prominent role in the Apache story, as I will tell it. Although the Army will continue to use them as auxiliaries and scouts, and they will be mentioned again. Unfortunately for the O'odham, though, or maybe fortunately, either way, the Army couldn't stand the O'odham purification after death rituals that I talked about last time, and they didn't like the fact that the O'odham preferred close-quarter combat to shooting. Bourke even called Pima Scouts a quote-unquote great fraud. But other American Indian groups will play a more prominent role, like the Navajo, who will also provide scouts throughout the remainder of the Apache Wars. And more on the Navajo Scouts in the next episode. After the Camp Grant massacre, President Grant would shake things up in the West. Besides demanding a trial over the massacre, which we know how that ended, but besides a trial, Grant fired Stoneman, that worthless guy out in Los Angeles, and installed one of the most acclaimed Indian fighters to have ever rampaged through the West, General George Crook. By this time, Crook was already a fabled Indian fighter, having been in battles against the Klamath, Paiute, Shasta, and a whole bunch of other Indians in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest specifically. He had been, after all, the commander of the Department of the Columbia in the Pacific Northwest. He'd actually already spent 13 years fighting Indians in that region. 8 of those years were before the Civil War, and 5 of them were after. Even he was, quote, tired of the Indian work, end quote. But that did not matter to Grant, who had him leapfrog a bunch of other more, quote unquote, qualified men of higher rank. Part of this leapfrogging was on account of General Sheridan. Despite thinking it unwise to place Crook in this position at first, by the end of Crook's career, General Sherman would even admit that Crook was the best Indian fighter in the Army. Period. Crook was an interesting man, from what I can tell. He was stocky and 6 feet tall, and he had a big mustache and enormous chops and sideburns, like unreal big. He also preferred riding a mule over a horse. He actually really loved mules. I'll talk about that in a minute. They were like his passion. Another passion for Crook was hunting. That may have been his true passion. Even while pursuing Apache, he'd take a break and hunt turkey or deer. He rarely wore his uniform, military uniform. Instead, he often wore civilian clothes. He rarely gave orders. He didn't speak too much. He was not a boisterous man, and his gray-blue eyes seemed to cast a melancholy look around him. The aforementioned Bourke was his right-hand man, and Bourke really liked Crook. Bourke, according to historian and author Paul Andrew Hutton in his Apache Wars, would, quote, serve Crook ably for the next 15 years as confidant, advisor, devoted friend, and clever press agent, end quote. Bourke would call Crook Sonny once you got to know him. Most everyone else thought Crook was sad, secretive, and gloomy. Crook was also as strict as a Mormon. He didn't swear, smoke, drink alcohol, coffee, or tea. During the Civil War, Crook participated in both stunning wins and crushing defeats. He was even at one point captured by Confederates in Maryland and held hostage in Richmond. But it seems, despite all that, Crook was a true military genius. Future President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, had served under Crook in the Civil War, and he would call him, quote, the brains of the Army, end quote. Crook also truly wanted to understand the Indian, not just fight him, although he didn't mind fighting him. He wanted to understand the Indian, whether that Indian was from Washington State, California, or Arizona. He studied them and tried to understand them, mostly so he could defeat them. He didn't always have the highest praise against the Indians he fought. He once said that the Indians were, quote, filthy, odoriferous, treacherous, ungrateful, pitiless, cruel, and lazy, end quote. But at the same time, he also grew fond of them as a people, and at times he was sickened by the deeds the army and the enemy forced him to carry out. But at the same time, he was a man of war, and he brought that war where he was ordered to. He brought it efficiently and lethally. Bourke said of Crook that he was, quote, admitted, even by the Indians, to be more of an Indian than the Indian himself, end quote. At the same time, again, he had no qualms pursuing and punishing the Apache he was charged with taming. He did, after all, call the Apache a, quote, impotent lot of cutthroats, end quote. That's a sentiment the Apache may have smiled at, and it's a sentiment that was certainly shared with many other Southwesterners at the time. Despite being done with the Indian business, Crook accepted his new position in Arizona and simply asked his commander for, quote, a few more horses and to be left alone, end quote. He'd get the horses, but he would not in any way be left alone. As a matter of fact, the meddling from the Federals was about to intensify exponentially under Grant's new peace policy. When Crook arrived in Arizona, one of the first things he did was move the department to Prescott and out of L.A. Like, getting out of L.A. should be everyone's goal, always, really. Crook then met with Whitman. He was the one in charge of Fort Grant, if you'll remember. Well, he met with Whitman, and he was not too impressed. Crook said of Whitman that he had, quote, deserted his colors and gone over to the Indian ring, bag and baggage, end quote. Crook would then have Whitman court-martialed and arrested. Uncle Billy Urey and the other southern Arizona citizens certainly liked that not-so-ringing endorsement of the military commander that they certainly felt had betrayed them. Uncle Billy was the quote-unquote mastermind, along with the Eliases of the Camp Grant massacre, if you'll recall. Next, Crook attempted to find out from the locals, Tucson locals, southern Arizona locals, what was the best way to go about conquering the Apache. So he interviewed the Arizona governor, and the territorial leader said, "Oh, the best way we know of is to hire you some Mexican guides, and they'll take you all over the country with little effort, and they'll find you some Apaches." Guides like the Mexican man I mentioned in the last episode, Merejildo Grijalva, for instance. Well, that is just what Crook did. He was new to the area. He was a man who listened to those who were experienced. He trusted what he was told. He also sided with Uncle Billy and the Eliases. So, with 50 hired Mexican scouts and 5 companies of men, Crook scoured the thorny, rocky, and rugged Arizona wilderness in an attempt to find and destroy his ultimate target, Cochise. But unfortunately, after a month, there was zero success. Not a single military engagement. They only saw a few Apaches. Crook was not impressed. Back at Fort Apache, Crook fired the Mexicans, except Grijalva, and began at square one. And Grijalva, he will pop up in and out of this episode and the remaining saga of the Apaches. And I will give you his background in a little bit. One of the reasons Crook fired the Mexicans, though, was that he thought they were more interested in collecting scout bounties after murdering the Apaches than subduing them properly. And Crook was probably on to something there. Crook was, as I previously said, a military genius. After the wasted month of searching in vain, Crook realized that there were 2 things being used in battle in the Southwest by the Army that should not be. The first was the cannon. They were just too unwieldy, too heavy, and they didn't work very well in battle in the ruggedness of Arizona. They slowed the Army down. The cannons had only been successful during the Battle of Apache Pass, and that was because the Apache weren't used to them, and the Army had been dug in. Every battle since had been against them by Apaches who had sprung a trap. there'd been no time to set up, aim, arm, and fire the cannons effectively. The second thing Crook realized that the army didn't need was the wagon, and pretty much for the same reason. So he decided instead that the army will only be using mule trains from then on, pack mule trains. Remember, he preferred riding them over horses anyways. Bourke wrote of Crook and his mules, quote, "He made the study of pack trains the great study of his life." End quote. The man really loved mules. In California, he created a way to separate the good mules from the bad ones. He also implemented a new policy to custom fit the cushion placed on a mule when they're carrying heavy loads. Before that, the aparejo or cushion, it was standard for every single mule no matter the size of the beast. But Crook realized that this standardization was killing a good amount of mules, and it was better for each mule to have their own custom-fitted aparejo. So other than the shedding of cannons and wagons and the adoption of better mules, his other innovation to fighting the Apache was to use the Apache. Use them against one another. Of this, David Roberts, old David Roberts, he writes in Once They Moved Like the Wind, that's his book over the Apache. But David Roberts writes, quote, "The keen student of Indian ways was in no danger of assuming all Apaches were alike. More than any officer before him, Crook grasped the ancient enmities that kept one band of Apaches at odds with another, and comprehended the absence of an overarching notion of an Apache people. He convinced himself, and then the Coyoteros and White Mountain men, that they might serve as scouts for the army in hunting down hostile Apaches of other bands." End quote. It was true that the Apaches would often be at odds with one another. In 1872, a group of Chihenne under a chief named Loco, Crazy, a group of Chihenne under Loco were living with Cochise and his Chihenne group when, most likely under the influence of Tiswin, a brawl ensued which saw 2 or 3 Apache killed and many more wounded. So using the Apache against one another was entirely plausible. Not only plausible, it was the key to his future success in battle, period. But how do you think this hiring of the Apaches as scouts, how do you think that went over with the locals of southern Arizona? The same locals who just proudly boasted about and then were acquitted of the Camp Grant massacre. In their hearts and in their newspapers, they sided with Pershing, who solidified their own thinking with the adage that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. Hiring the Apache to lead the army in pursuit of other Apache? That was insane. That was treason. Akin to the Romans letting the barbarians lead their legions. After all, what if these quote-unquote friendly Apache turned on us, on the army? What if they spied on us citizens during the entire campaign and then snuck up on us in our sleep? The prominent Mexican-American vecino and participant in the Camp Grant massacre, Juan Elias, he said of the idea, quote, "The Apache scouts are, in my opinion, very unreliable, and they should not be employed at all to fight their own race." End quote. To many other local residents, Crook was handing the keys of the city over to the criminals. But as Roberts puts it, quote, "The notion was fixed in Crook's head long before it became a motto of the Southwest. It takes an Apache to catch an Apache." End quote. So at Fort Apache, Crook gathered the Apache people who lived there all together, and he laid down his plan and the eventual future of the people. According to Bourke, Crook said, quote, "The white people were crowding in all over the western country, and soon it would be impossible for anyone to live upon game. It would be driven away or killed off. Far better for everyone to make up his mind to plant and to raise horses, cows, and sheep, and make his living in that way. His animals would thrive and increase while he slept. And in less than no time, the Apache would be wealthier than the Mexican." End quote. I'll talk more about this inevitable encroachment in a little bit. It is an extremely important theme, not just with the Apache, but with all Native Americans or American Indians. But of this speech, according to Bourke, the Apache would occasionally utter ensue, or good, especially that last part about being richer than a Mexican. Crook then went on to say how every Apache who surrendered right now would be forgiven of their past crimes and depredations, and they'd be left alone and treated the same as the whites. Interestingly, just a few years before, in Oregon, when Crook was fighting the Pit River Indians, he had a pretty similar interaction that ultimately led to those people's complete surrender. The chief of that tribe had said he wanted some peace, but Crook, after at first refusing to meet with this chief, eventually he changed his mind. He told the chief that he was disappointed that they wanted to surrender because, he said at that time, quote, "I was in hopes that you would continue the war, and then, though I were to kill only one of your warriors while you killed 100 of my men, you would have to wait for those little people," pointing to the Indian children, "to grow to fill the place of your braves, while I can get any number of soldiers the next day to fill the place of my 100 men. In this way, it would not be very long before we would have you all killed, and then the government would have no more trouble with you." End quote. Obviously, at that realization of what Crook just said, the Pit River Indians were completely disheartened, and surrender was inevitable. The Apaches, they were not the Pit River Indians, and while they did understand the situation, they were still the same Indians who loved freedom above all else, preferring it even to death. But to be a scout and to grow wealthier than a Mexican, that was tempting. Some Apache signed up right there on the spot. And again, I'll talk about this theme of the white wave in a bit. With that stunning little victory in his grasp, Crook's first order of business was to go after the most wild and far-off Apaches that then existed. This was a group of Western Apache we haven't talked about. They are known as the Tontos, as in Tonto Natural Bridge or Tonto National Monument. They lived near the Mogollon Rim, near modern cities like Payson and Strawberry. They inhabited the lush forests of the region that held mythical places like Montezuma's Castle and Sedona. They also lived in the vast wilderness area that is still wild today, and it is known as Agua Fria National Monument. These Apaches' ancestors may have been the ones to burn out the Mogollon, aka Humanos, of this region. So Crook was after these guys. He was after them for, well, I'm not too sure. They were the furthest and they were the quote-unquote wildest Apache. So maybe the army was just reining them in first. I didn't read about any specific depredations, but it's probably that we're beyond that now, and the March of Manifest Destiny determined that all Indians must be devoid of their wild freedom and brought into civilization. And Crook was starting with these Apache after his failed attempt to catch Cochise. Accompanying Crook were his Apache Scouts. But even with them, the whole crew got lost in the dark, dense forest and rocks of the Mogollon region. Much to Crook's frustration, they moved slowly and cumbersomely through the wild, unknown region. And at one point, a massive monsoon-style thunderstorm rained hell upon them. Crook even wrote that during the storm he became nervous as, quote, "trees were crashed to splinters not far from us," end quote. And then, after the storm, when the sky had cleared, the soldiers and cavalrymen, they came upon a park-like area with pine trees, no underbrush, and just beauty all around them. Crook, Bourke, and a few other officers then rode ahead kind of to survey the beauty and to discuss how the coming Americans could best use this quote-unquote untouched land. And then, Curiously, they heard a whizzing noise and a thump. Lo and behold, an arrow was sticking out of one of the nearby pine trees the men had just been admiring. And then another arrow came whizzing by Crook's scalp. Like Trump in July of 2024, mere inches spared the new department commander from getting to the happy place sooner than he would have liked. Crook, realizing the situation, immediately pulled his sidearm and shot the offender in his arm. A quick battle then ensued that saw some 15 or 20 Tontos chased towards the edge of the Mogollon Rim, where the army was sure they had them trapped. Except these Apaches, instead of being captured, they just leapt off the edge. When the army approached, expecting to see the worst, well, I'll let David Roberts finish the story for me. He writes, quote, "But when they approached the cliff, the soldiers saw the two Tontos running down, quote, the merest thread of a trail outlined in the vertical face of the basalt," end quote. No one even considered pursuing them. End all quotes. It's a cinematic scene, really. From the arrow narrowly missing Crook and thumping into the tree, to the troopers watching the Apaches zoom down the cliff side of the Mogollon Rim, that's exciting stuff. This small skirmish, though, it was a success in Crook's eyes. Back at a fort near Prescott, Fort Verdi, Crook began planning a for-real, full-scale invasion of western Apacheria. The might of Crook's hammer was about to fall on the Arizona Apache. Unless, of course, the bureaucrats in D.C. had something to say about that. Obviously, they did have something to say about that, and their mouthpiece was a man named Vincent Collier. Vincent Collier was elected to the Board of Peace Commissioners, which were the bureaucrats who were to enact the peace policy's parameters, Grant's peace policy. The board was started in Washington to protect the Indians from the quote-unquote depredations of frontier justice. The kind of frontier justice that unfortunately leads to the Camp Grant massacre. So, while I despise bureaucrats, sometimes their aim, or I should say their goals, are righteous and worthwhile. The Camp Grant massacre was a horrible event, full stop. And that massacre obviously infuriated these bureaucrats, as well as the Northerners who just killed hundreds of thousands of their Anglo brethren over the institution of slavery. So Grant sent Vincent Collier down to Arizona to beat the Apaches with words and promises instead of bullets and battles. Collier, like many of these progressives, was a Quaker pacifist, and he was from New York City. He was an artist and a hardcore abolitionist. So hardcore, in fact, that he led an all-Negro regiment in the Civil War that he himself had mustered, or, began. He gathered it together himself. I don't know how a pacifist musters a regiment, but he did. Collier was now going to take the same attitude and zeal to the Apache of the American Southwest that he had to the Americans in the South. He truly believed the Apache to be always the victims and never the perpetrators. He thought the Apache never would have attacked the Americans if the Americans had treated them better from the very beginning. And, every Apache leader says the same thing. And maybe he had a point, I don't know. But hopefully you have listened to every previous episode before this, so you understand both parties are pretty equally to blame for the inevitable violence which occurred. Although one party's insistence on never settling down and using the labor of others to collect their food and belongings, that probably plays a greater role than those who are getting robbed and killed by raids in the night. Remember the Humanos, the Salinas Puebloans, the Texas Plains tribes, the Spanish, the Mexican, So Collier believed the hype of men like Cochise and Victorio, who said God gave everything to the white man and nothing to the Indian, so they had to take it themselves. Needless to say, the men of the military in Arizona were none too fond of the Quaker bureaucrat. Bourke called Collier, quote, that spawn of hell, end quote, which wasn't really how Bourke normally spoke of anyone. Crook also couldn't stand the self-righteous, haughty man. Crook said Collier, quote, harangued the Indians on his way, making peace as he went, and the Indians, just immediately behind him, left a trail of blood behind them from the murdered citizens. End quote. The always colorful Arizona Press, this one the Arizona Minor newspaper, it called Collier a quote-unquote cold-blooded scoundrel, and that the citizens of Arizona should, quote, dump the old devil into the shaft of some mine and pile rocks upon him until he is dead. End quote. I mean, how do you really feel about him? Of course, author Carl Jacobi, in his Shadows at Dawn, attempts to paint Collier in a much better light, and he quotes various higher-ups who say he was a good Christian man. I did get a little tired of Jacobi's extreme bias, to be honest. From what I can tell in reading the many reports and the many accounts and the other books, Collier was not a man who was beloved by his fellow Anglo, nor respected in the end by the Apache. But he no doubt had good intentions, like every liberal progressive, almost every, despite them being consistently wrong about everything. I will say, though, he wasn't a bad artist, and he probably really did want to help. Well, no, I know that he wanted to help the Apache. He would travel all over the West and Alaska, setting up reservations and trying to be a good Christian. But while on the plains, he did draw a mean bison. It's pretty good. I'll give him that. Regardless of how everyone in New Mexico, Arizona, and on the pages of history books felt of the man, he did have considerable weight behind him. The full weight of the American government. And this American government also gave him $70,000. And with that power and money, in September of 1871, during his visit, he created the first Apache reservation at Tularosa, New Mexico. So I believe I have previously stated that the fort and Camp Tularosa, I previously incorrectly stated that they were in the Tularosa Basin near Alamogordo and the White Sands and the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico. I believe I said that in the last episode. If I did, I was wrong. I assumed it was over there because they have the same name. Camp Tularosa, Tularosa Basin. But the Tularosa camp that everyone wanted Cochise and Victorio to go to is north of the Mogollon Mountains. It is straight east across the New Mexican border from Fort Apache in the White Mountains of Arizona. This Fort Tularosa is south of Quemado and Pie Town. And I just drove right past the beautiful area in the spring of 24. It is a gorgeous mountain spot, but it simply would not do for the Chihini and Chokonen leaders. The water was bad, the winter sucked, and the planting season was too brief. Plus, they wanted to be near their homelands, which were the beautiful Mimbres River Valley of the Mogollon Mountains to the south and the Dragoon Mountains to the southwest in Arizona. Victorio, who I will talk about in depth in the next episode, he had repeatedly said he'd go to a reservation with his people, sure, yeah, but not there. Cochise would also say the same thing, as we will soon hear. Well, actually, I opened the episode with a quote about him not wanting to go there. Nobody wanted to go there. That did not matter to Collier, though, and this forceful decision would have pretty dire consequences. From the Fort Tularosa, Collier then went to Arizona and established the White Mountain Apache Reservation. And that reservation is still the law of the land today. And it will come up a lot in future episodes. Collier then set up 5 more temporary reservations over the next month of his visit. By the time he left, rather surprisingly, 4,000 Apaches would be on various reservations throughout the Southwest. One of the last peoples he met with were the earlier mentioned Tonto Apache, the same Tonto Apache who Crook and Bourke had chased off the Mogollon Rim. The Tonto chief Collier met with would end up giving an eloquent speech to the radical Quaker pacifists from New England. The Tonto chief told Collier, quote, "We are tired of living in caves and on the tops of cold mountains. My women carry water 2 or 3 miles from the little streams. They get water at night because we are afraid of soldiers. Even rabbits are safer than my Tontos. We hide our children behind big rocks when we go to hunt the deer, but deer are not so many now. You say Tontos must not steal cattle, but we must steal or starve. White Americans have stolen our cornfields and our wheat fields. What are we to do?" End quote. Again with the steal or starve thing. This time it's the Americans' fault, though. Not the Mexicans, not the Spaniards before that, not the Humanos before that. If I were being honest, though, it is true that the Americans were moving into and filling every arable piece of land in the West. Oftentimes, they had no idea the Apache or any tribe had planted anything there because the Apache, especially, they only stayed seasonally. So this Tonto chief, I'm sorry I do not know his name, I should. It might be Red Ant, though. But he is correct in that the Anglos were stealing all of their land or trampling their crops with the many herds of cattle that were flocking in from Texas. Once Collier left, Crook gave the entire Apacheria peoples until February 16th, 1872 to come in onto the reservations or else. Obviously, they'll be killed or captured. As Roberts puts it, Crook planned with the Apache to, quote, "hunt down and kill or capture with all the rigor at his command." End quote. After Collier left, though, the Apaches very quickly abandoned the reservations and began again their raids and murders. Heck, a stagecoach carrying a government surveying team was hit and 7 of the 8 passengers were killed. Another notable event was the murder of a prominent East Coast journalist. In the 5 months immediately after Collier's departure, 40 frontier Americans would be killed by Apache. A state of affairs the locals had predicted. Much to Crook's disappointment, the deadline of February was pushed back until May of that year. The Apaches simply refused to relocate to places they didn't want to. And it's hard to blame them. But the federal government was not yet ready to prosecute another war against them while they were trying to push the peace policy. Victorio, as the deadline approached, famously reiterated to the army that he was not going to relocate to Camp Tularosa, and that the army can feed the government's rations to the wolves and the bears for all he cared. In the end, Victorio would indeed head to the reservation, however briefly. We shall return to Crook shortly. It certainly seems that the entire U.S. military might at this time was focused on bringing in or destroying one Apache in particular. That particular Apache would obviously be Cochise. Author Edwin Sweeney, who wrote the seminal biography of Mangus Coloradus, he also wrote the incredible and detailed and thorough biography of Cochise. Now, it would be reasonable to assume that someone doing a deep dive into the great saga of Apache history would have read Edwin Sweeney's Cochise, Chiricahua Apache Chief. But alas, I did not. It is $100, and I believe it is 500 pages. That, of course, does not faze me. The page number, I mean. The $100 sure does faze me. But the reason I did not read the book was because I chose to focus on the much less known and much less focused on Mangus Coloradus, who is inexorably tied to Cochise. But also, I did purchase and read Edwin Sweeney's From Cochise to Geronimo, which has over 700 pages, and it's an enormous volume, and it was worth it. and I will quote from it extensively in the coming episodes. All of the other sources I used talked enough about Cochise and his life and whereabouts and actions that I believed I could get away with not reading Sweeney's book over the Apache Man, although I am sure it is phenomenal, just like Sweeney's other 2 books which I read. So Cochise. He was the boogeyman of the Southwest. He was the main character of every Anglo and Mexican vecino's nightmares. He haunted the army. He haunted the papers in the East. He is a giant of historical proportions, especially in the American Southwest. He was also seemingly a giant when people met him. He was around my height, so below 6 feet, but over 5 feet 10 inches. Taller than my brother Sean, for sure. Cochise was extremely muscular, with, quote, every muscle being well developed and firm, end quote. He weighed 175 pounds, and his chest was deep, which makes sense, as he and many other American Indians used to run like the wind, up and down mountains and canyons, as if they were walking on the sidewalk. Cochise wore 3 large brass rings that dangled from each ear. His hair was long and black with a few silvers here and there. His face was smooth, since he'd painfully pulled all the hair out with tweezers, which most all Apache did. His eyes were black. He was gentle in both speech and gesture. He, unlike other Apaches, he rarely gestured. He never smiled. He was noted as seeming sad. Or as Bourke described him, he had a melancholy expression. The Apache called him Chias, which means oak, on account of the strength and quality of oak wood. Anglos, not being great with Apache words, added the co in front. Cochise. Dakluji, in Eve Ball's Inde, said of merely viewing the man's teepee, quote, it was as much as anyone's life was worth to even look toward them, end quote. Dakluji was only 4 when he got to look upon the man, but he never forgot it. Part of his myth was his propensity for violence and torture. Whether that violence was real or not, it certainly seemed real enough to the entire nation, and the Southwesterners especially at this time. That's why everyone from Cushing to Crook was out for Cochise's blood. How much of the stories we hear, and they heard in that era, how many of them are true? It is certainly true that, yes, on multiple occasions, Cochise hung his victims upside down and burned them alive inches over a flame. It is also true that he enjoyed the occasional naked drag of a victim behind his horse in the good old thorny and stony Arizona desert hellscape. And yes, it is noted that he buried victims up to their necks near ant mounds, so that the little critters could consume the poor soul alive by entering their propped open mouths. That's the story, anyways. It is also true that he was indeed, as the U.S. representative for the Arizona Territory put it, quote, undoubtedly the bravest and most skillful Apache leader that the Americans ever had to cope with, end quote. I mean, in battle, people witnessed him slip to the side of his horse while hanging onto the horse's mane and the horse's neck, so as to use the horse as a shield against the enemy's bullets. But he wasn't all fear and hate. Cochise was noted by future Chiricahua Reservation assistant to Tom Jeffords, a man named Fred Hughes. Well, Hughes said of Cochise, quote, in conversation he was very pleasant, and to his family and those immediately around him he was more affectionate than the average white man. He showed nothing of the brutish nature generally attributed to him. It was astonishing also to see what power he had over this brutal tribe. For while they idolized and almost worshipped him, no man was ever held in greater fear, his glance being enough to squelch the most obstreperous Chiricahua in the tribe. End quote. Obstreperous means difficult to control. So Cochise had the power to quiet and control the most rambunctious of the Chiricahua. Obviously, Part of Cochise's legend gets mixed up with the stories of other Apaches, and every single thing that happened in the Southwest was blamed on Cochise at this time, including Cushing's death, which we now know as Ho and Geronimo. And it was true that Apaches would tie people up to saguaros, the giant spiky cactus with the cool arms. If you haven't seen one, you got to go to Arizona and check them out. They're amazing. I love them, and each one of the saguaros seems like they have their own little personality. But Apache at this time would tie people up to saguaros with wet strips of rawhide. It is important to understand when I mention that the rawhide was wet. Rawhide tightens when it dries. So the poor victim would be increasingly constricted against the saguaro and its spikes as the sun blared down and as the hours ticked by, both suffocating the victim and sticking the cactus's spines deeper into them. Even worse, like many southwestern peoples, when the Apache captured a victim that may or may not have killed one of their own, they often gave these captured souls over to their women. Roberts says of this, quote, Apaches often turned captives over to their women, who were reputed to be even crueler torturers than the men. One pioneer maintained that survivors of an 1880 Apache attack, quote, saw squaws stick pieces of wood into the victim's bowels while alive, then crush their heads to a jelly with rocks. End all quotes. I mentioned a few episodes back that vengeance was the main driver of Apache attacks, and since, forever, the Apache have been victims of violence and death, real or imagined. Heck, that just comes with raiding and stealing as being your main source of revenue. Violence and death occurs, so that alone makes the Apache unique in the eyes of Anglo-Americans and Spaniards before them. But another curious Apache quirk is their view of pain. Here is an extended quote from Roberts about this relationship to pain that the Apache had. The Apache attitude toward pain was altogether different from the Americans. Pain was a fact of life, and to greet it stoically and endure it silently was the mark of character. From early childhood, boys were schooled in pain. They would be taught, for instance, to place dry sage on their skins, set fire to it, and let it burn to ashes without flinching. In winter, they had to go out at dawn and roll a ball of snow with bare hands until called away from the task. In foot races, laggards were lashed by adults. End quote. They are hardcore. A lot of this training of pain was because the Apache lived in a painful environment. And more importantly, they lived a painful life of raiding and warfare. Roberts goes on about this training, quote, along with an incomparable training in endurance and athletic skills, this tutorship in pain turned a boy into a potential warrior. At an early age, boys were paired off for hand-to-hand fights that ended only with the drawing of blood. In teams of 4, they shot stones with slingshots at each other. Later, they made small bows and arrows with sharp wooden points and played at warfare. One of Oppler's informants recalled a playmate whose eye had been put out in such combat practice. As well as enduring pain, boys were taught to inflict it. They were given captured birds and animals to torture, and their inventiveness was rewarded. The emphasis on torture in Apache life remains shocking to modern sensibilities, despite our latter-day faith in cultural relativism. But from the Indian point of view, an ordeal by pain was part of the order of things. End all quotes. Much like Dan Carlin said of the Japanese, the Apache were just like every other southwestern Indian, except even more so. This was how Cochise was raised. This was Cochise's environment. And then you add the incident of the cutting of the tent where he lost family and friends. You add the years of violence and death, the murder of his father-in-law, the many mirrored and echoed stories of his friends like Geronimo, who lost his family in a bloody deceit. Cochise was just like every other Apache, except even more so. At this time of the early 1870s, Cochise's favorite hideout was the southern Arizona mountain range known as the Dragoon Mountains. These mountains only reach an elevation of 7,519 feet, but they are extremely remote and extremely rugged. I've never been in them, but I have seen them, near Tombstone, and you can see them from the Chiricahua Mountains. They're on the other side to the west of the valley. And these Dragoon Mountains are surrounded by a hot, harsh, and dry desert landscape. But up on them peaks, they're one of those sky islands that I love so much and that the Apache loved. They had plenty of greenery and trees and nuts and berries and game. There were also plenty of canyons, crevices, spires, cliffs, caves, and boulders, lots of hiding places. Doug Hawking, the author of Tom Jeffords, friend of Cochise, he described the possible camp in the Dragoon Mountains that Cochise may have had around this time. The camp was called China Camp, or China Meadow, and he writes of it, quote, "High up on the side of the Dragoon Mountains, behind the Shepherd Formation, 2 stony pillars guard the entrance to a spring-fed meadow of 30 or 40 acres. From between the pillars, all of the San Pedro Valley, from San Jose Peak in Sonora to beyond Tres Alamos in the north, is visible. Half a mile to the east, the Sulphur Springs Valley is visible from the crest of the mountains. Cochise would have had perfect intelligence for everything happening in both valleys, and thus control of southeast Arizona." End quote. The Dragoon Mountains were the quintessential mountain fortress I described the Apaches having in that very first episode. The Dragoon Mountains also have the added benefit of being on the border of not only New Mexico, but near Old Mexico as well. And not too far from West Texas to boot. It was a perfect spot for Cochise to hide out in and live as he thought every single Apache should, which was freely. But things were happening inside of Cochise that would ultimately seal his fate. Things no one back then could stop or even really detect. Cochise wasn't long for this world, and soon he would go the way of all the earth. But before that would happen, he was going to try to do what was best for his people. And that would lead to quite a bit more violence at first. In 1869, so backing up just a little bit, Cochise let an American military officer meet with him at the base of his Dragoon Mountains, not far from the infamous Tombstone. During that talk, Cochise was recorded as saying, quote, "I lost nearly 100 of my people in the last year, principally from sickness. The Americans killed a good many. I have not 100 Indians now. 10 years ago I had 1,000. The Americans are everywhere, and we must live in bad places to shun them." End quote. I mean, that is a pretty staggering admission. From 1,000 to 100? This campaign of running from the Americans was clearly unsustainable. It wasn't just the bullets of the Americans that killed them, but also the constant running which led to malnutrition, and that's because they couldn't plant what few crops they attempted to cultivate. This running and malnourishment, it led to diseases and deaths that had nothing to do with lead and steel. It was a sad state of affairs for Cochise and the Chiricahua Apache. During this meeting, Cochise admitted to being wounded by the Americans not once, but twice. Once he had been shot in the neck. Like in the neck. The next time he had been shot in the leg. He said about that wound, quote, "I had a bad leg for some time afterward." End quote. Cochise could not keep this up forever. Nor could his people. He was nearly 60 at this time, after all. A year later, in 1870, Cochise met again with the Americans. He was truly by this time tired of the constant fighting and running. He and his people had been doing nothing but killing and raiding since the cutting of the tent, really. Killing and raiding and being killed. This meeting in 1870 was actually a massive event that saw some 790 Apaches meet with the civilian agent, William Arney. He had been appointed by President Grant to begin to carry out his peace policy in Arizona. Cochise and 96 of his Chiricahua Chokonin Apaches, they came to this massive event. So did Victorio, the chief of the Chihenne. During this meeting, Cochise met face-to-face with Arney, but was disappointed that he was not meeting face-to-face with Grant. He said something to the effect of, "Real men meet face to face. They don't send a piece of paper to be read from." Grant was not coming, though. And so Cochise and the rest of the Apache would have to sit with this bureaucrat who was reading from Grant, and Grant was calling himself the Great Father and all that. Grant was saying he wanted the Apache to be on a reservation, to which Cochise said, quote, "The Apaches want to run around like a coyote. They don't want to be put in a corral." End quote. Arnie responded with, quote, "The Great Father didn't want to put them in a corral. He wants them to eat and dress like a white man, have plenty of everything, and be contented." End quote. But as we know from the last episode, the Apache don't want any of that. They want little, and what they need, they steal from the Mexicans and others anyways. I still can't get over that. This meeting would end with Cochise refusing to settle in that Tularosa Basin reservation that he felt they'd be trapped in. Instead, Cochise returned to either his Dragoon Mountains or the Sierra Madres of Mexico. And there he would escalate his reign of terror on the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. This reign of terror would see Cushing react punitively before he was killed by Ho and Geronimo, like I talked about last time. And for almost 100 years, that death was indeed blamed on Cochise, but it was not Cochise who killed Cushing. But it's easy to see why the world thought that. In 1871, Cochise would have another meeting with the Americans where he came armed and with many of his warriors, and it was a meeting in which he refused to dismount. He was not allowing another cutting of the tent. He didn't want to lose more family and friends. By now, his hatred and distrust of the White Eyes was almost as strong as the Apache hatred towards the Mexicans. By the early 1870s, Cochise always traveled with armed bodyguards. He also apparently refused to enter into any building or tent and instead tried to meet on open ground. Oftentimes, he wouldn't even dismount in case he needed a quick getaway. On the rare occasion that he and his people camped near a reservation or a fort, it was always around 15 miles or so away from the fort. Although he would allow his people to go get some rations from the government, he himself, though, absolutely always refused to eat any rations that the Americans gave him because he was probably rightfully so afraid that they were poisoned. I mean, that's what the Mexicans were famous for doing. And later the American government would poison booze during the Prohibition, and that was their own people. After this meeting in 1871, though, Cochise would renew his reign of terror as usual. One of these raids that Cochise managed to pull off was in a broad daylight, and it was on a military outpost known as Camp Crittenden, and that's in southern Arizona. Cochise and his band of Chokonen took off with the entire horse herd of 54 horses and 7 mules. Crook, in response, called Cochise and his Chokonen Apache, quote, "the worst of all the Apaches," end quote. And that Cochise was, quote, "an uncompromising enemy to all mankind," end quote. Crook, like Cushing before him, he wanted Cochise's head. This was getting personal. There was one White Eyes that Cochise did trust, though, and that was a man named Tom Jeffords. Jeffords had an incredible life that had moments of it which kind of mirrored Cass Heights. And like Cass Height, I cover Tom Jeffords' extraordinary life for subscribers in a Roadrunner exclusive episode. So head to Substack or the website and sign up to enjoy that episode. As the deadline mentioned earlier approached, the deadline that attempted to force all Apache onto reservations, Cochise would meet with a new Mexican military official named Colonel Gordon Granger. Crook was in Arizona, and Granger was in charge of New Mexico. So Crook was ordered to round up all the Apache in that territory, and then he'd move them into New Mexico with Granger's help, and then Granger would escort the Apache to the Tularosa Reservation. But Granger could sense trouble. So he called a meeting. He called a meeting with Cochise. And this meeting was held at the ill-fated and short-lived Cañada Alamosa Reservation, which was about to move to Tularosa. So Granger called a meeting with Cochise, and Cochise actually showed up. He was probably camped out nearby at that time. But this meeting did not get off to a good start. Granger, like almost all Americans, he was pretty ignorant of the Apache ways. So when he handed over a rolled-up personal letter from General Grant to Cochise, personal letter that was tied together with red string, he had no idea of the bad omen that he was presenting to Cochise. To the Apache, the color red could attract lightning, and lightning was one of the most powerful natural occurrences in the Apache's worldview. It was the visible manifestation of their supernatural being's power. These beings were known as the Thunder People. Lightning was the Thunder People's arrows, kind of like Zeus. These Thunder beings, in previous epochs and eras, they did the hunting for the Apache. But the Apache took that goodwill by these supernatural Thunder beings. They took the goodwill for granted. And eventually, the Thunder People withdrew their help. And that left the Apache to hunt for themselves. Hunt, and in turn, raid. Roberts talks more about the power of lightning, and he wrote, quote, "Lightning was thus a profoundly ambiguous phenomenon. To fend off the danger of being struck by it, Apaches used charms. When lightning split the sky, they wore sage in their hair, made sure nothing red was near their persons, refused to eat, and uttered a spitting noise to show respect. When lightning struck nearby, it left a pungent powder in the air. Perhaps the ozone an electric discharge releases. If a person inhaled the powder, he could fall ill from lightning sickness. Yet, lightning could be a force for good, and Apaches prayed directly to it." End quote. So President Grant's personal note wrapped in red string was like sending a lightning bolt across the nation directly into the hands of Cochise. Upon seeing the red string, the Apache warrior chief exclaimed, "The red is not good." Granger was taken aback, but he tried to patch up the meeting as he implored Cochise to please just settle down in the Tularosa Reservation. "We've established it just for you. That's all we ask, and have been asking for years." But Cochise could not be shaken. Years later, a witness to this event would attempt to recall what Cochise said, and I'm going to quote them to you, whether they're spot on or not. But this is eloquent of the message that Cochise essentially gave to Granger. I really enjoy the way Cochise speaks. Quote, "I have fought long and as best I could against you. I have destroyed many of your people. But where I have destroyed one white man, many have come in his place. But where an Indian has been killed, there has been none to come in his place. So that the great people that welcomed you with acts of kindness to this land are now but a feeble band that fly before your soldiers as the deer before the hunter. I am the last of my family, a family that for very many years have been the leaders of this people. And on me depends their future. Whether they shall utterly vanish from the land, or that a small remain for a few years to see the sun rise over these mountains, their home." End quote. It's a sad speech, but one that was repeated all throughout the land that would become the United States, especially as Manifest Destiny ebbed westward. Much like the Pitt River Indians had realized with Crook, Cochise was realizing the same unchangeable future. The White Eyes would never cease their march westward. And again, more on this important theme in a moment. Cochise would never go east, though, which is why Grant wrote him a personal letter. But Cochise still understood that time was not on the red man's side. Which is why in this meeting, before the deadline, Cochise told Granger that he would indeed move his people onto a reservation as long as it was near their sacred hot spring known as Ojo Caliente and not the Tularosa Reservation. He would also not visit Washington, D.C., which Granger continued to implore him to do. Cochise hated the white man's way. He told Granger he wasn't going east and he wasn't going to, quote, eat little fishes out of tin boxes, end quote. To the Apache, fish were too close to snakes, and the people steered clear of eating either. And Cochise thought the Americans' habit of eating tinned fish, he thought it was despicable, unmanly, unhinged even. But Granger was persistent, and he told Cochise, quote, "The great father in Washington wants you and Loco and Victorio to go to Washington," end quote. Cochise replied, quote, "I am not a child and would rather talk to you in this country." He goes on to say rather eloquently, as he often did, quote, "I would much rather live here in the mountains where the grass dies. For when I lie down, if it gets in my hair and I can get it out, I know that all things are right here." End quote. Granger, in one last attempt, told Cochise, okay, fine. Why don't you come to Cañada Alamosa, where we have a fort, and we'll shower you with gifts. Angrily, Cochise turned to his white friend, I cover in the Roadrunner episode, his white friend being Tom Jeffords. Cochise turned to Tom and he says, quote, "You believe these white men? I trusted them once. I went to their camp. My brother and 2 nephews were hung. No, I will not go." End quote. After the meeting, Cochise and his Choconin Apache, they left New Mexico for that ancient presidio of Janos in Old Mexico. This reservation at Fort Tularosa, which Cochise refused to live at, it would ultimately only see 350 Apaches settle down, and not even for very long. During this time, when Crook was waiting for the end of the deadline so he could enact his righteous war against the Apaches, during this time, Grant and Sherman decided to give peace one more chance. And that chance came in the form of Brigadier General Oliver Otis Howard, often called O.O. Howard. Although he was 2 years younger than Crook, he did in fact outrank the man. Howard was quite bearded, and he lacked his right arm, as he had lost it early in the Civil War. He had a few military setbacks against the Rebs once he returned to combat, and although his performance at Gettysburg was questionable, he still overcame those setbacks to rise in the ranks. Howard was a staunch liberal Republican abolitionist. You know, it's weird to say liberal Republican, but back then, these Republicans were extremely liberal. I mean, the emancipation of slaves, going to war to force that. So Howard was a staunch liberal Republican abolitionist, and before being sent to Arizona in 1872, he was head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and that was the government commission to help the assimilation of the freed slaves back into Southern life. Also, the black college known as Howard University is named after him. So despite his progressive demeanor and being from the Northeast, Howard was not a Quaker. Instead, he was a fundamentalist Christian. And I couldn't track down what that meant or what denomination it was, except for the phrase New Light Christian. I'm not sure what that is or who they were. Surprisingly, the Arizonans were much kinder to Howard than they had been to Collier. And that's probably on account of his war wounds. But don't get me wrong, they still didn't like the peace policy and the money laundering scheme known as the Indian Ring. And they accused Howard of being a part of the Indian Ring, but he was not. He was on the up and up. Crook wasn't too thrilled with Howard at first. He was more thrilled than he had been with Collier. But he still felt his mission was to be accomplished with gunpowder and swords, not prayers and promises. Crook said of Howard, quote, "I was very much amused at the general's opinion of himself. He told me that he thought the Creator had placed him on earth to be the Moses to the Negro. Having accomplished that mission, he felt satisfied his next mission was with the Indian." End quote. Howard, for his part, thought Crook was quote-unquote peculiar, but then again, who didn't? He also said Crook was such a good listener and spoke so little that Crook made the speaker talk even more. Well, Howard, that could also be that you like to talk? I would know. I too am unconsciously drawn out in discourse during many conversations, as he put it. Later, the two would become friends, and they would both go on to fight for Indian rights later in life. Much later in life. For now, things between the two would be tense. One of Howard's first meetings with the Indians was the meeting I spoke about in the very beginning of the episode, the one where the O'odham were present. Well, also in attendance was a man named Eskiminzin. Eskiminzin, I did mention him last time, he was the chief survivor of the Camp Grant massacre, and he was father-in-law to the Apache Kid. He's also the one who said it takes a strong man to kill a friend after he killed his friend after the Camp Grant massacre. And about that slaughter of his friend, by shooting him in the face, he was never arrested or tried for that cold-blooded murder. Besides Eskiminzin, there was the Apache leader Santos. There was also Uncle Billy Ori, the Elias brothers, Whitman, who was in charge of Camp Grant, and Crook. There was a whole bunch of other people as well. It was an enormous and very significant meeting. Whitman, he had allowed the Apache to live there, which had allowed the massacre, and because of this, he had been arrested by Crook. But Howard had released him, and that releasing of Whitman by Howard, that undermined Crook's authority, and Crook was none too pleased about this. But again, Howard outranked Crook. Well, at this big old meeting, Howard, whom the Apache would come to call Nantan Biganigori, or his arm is shortened. So Howard, this bearded man missing an arm, he strolled into the amassed congregation of Arizonans and Apaches and O'odham, and he immediately got on his knees in front of everybody and began to pray loudly. This just startled the heck out of the Apache, who, quote, scattered like partridges when they see a hawk, end quote. They thought this strange new man was performing some kind of black magic medicine on them. Story has it, in less than 2 minutes, the entire congregations of Apaches had fled. Eskiminzin himself is quoted as saying to Whitman, quote, "What do you mean bringing that man here to make bad medicine against us?" End quote. Eventually, the Apaches were slowly coaxed back into the meeting, but they did remain leery of the man for a time. Now, the goal of this meeting was to smooth things over between all of the parties involved in the Camp Grant massacre. That, and to remove Eskiminzin's band of Apache, as well as amass other Chiricahua and Western Apache. He wanted to amass them all onto a reservation that would be known as the San Carlos Reservation. That is a place subscribers know well on account of the Apache Kids series. This place was known as Hell's 40 Acres, and it was described by Lieutenant Britton Davis, the Indian agent assigned there. It was described as a place where, quote, almost continuously dry, hot, dusty, and gravel-laden winds swept the plain, denuding it of every vestige of vegetation. In summer, a temperature of 110 degrees in the shade was cool weather. At all other times of the year, flies, gnats, unnameable bugs, and beasts of the air swarmed in millions. End quote. Well, that sounds lovely. But truthfully, at Camp Grant, malaria and other diseases had constantly broken out. Not to mention there just wasn't enough water, that all-important bringer of life. At their spot in Yavapai Canyon near Fort Grant that they loved so much, it was just too tough to live. So this new reservation, named San Carlos, was to be their home. And it still is today a federally recognized Apache reservation. And I will talk a lot more about San Carlos in the next couple episodes as well. As mentioned earlier, Crook was still agitated that Whitman had been released, which undermined Crook's authority. Esquiminzin and the Apache were still outraged that the vecinos in town had their orphaned children, because remember, they had been stolen after the massacre. Howard was distraught that Uncle Billy Urey and the Eliases had been acquitted and were at the meeting right then. No one was too thrilled to be there, and no one was thrilled that the other party was there. Then Santos, he did the rock thing, saying, "We will be peaceful as long as this rock exists." But Crook saw through that, and he had actually seen Santos do that same trick before going back on his word, breaking that promise. Whitman, still on the Apache side, had also seen this speech, yet he still believed Santos and the Apache. Then the vecinos actually brought the kidnapped children to the meeting, and Esquiminzin, stuttering the whole time and absolutely disgusted that their Apache children were being flaunted and used as pawns, he and the White Mountain Apache women attempted to physically grab and take the children, but the children were screaming, they were clinging to their adopted parents, and the Mexican-American vecinos were clinging to the children. Chaos erupted, and Crook, he just angrily stormed out, which left Howard pretty embarrassed. After the meeting, Crook would meet with Howard, and he would give him a stern talking to that would shake Howard for the rest of the day and well into the evening. Crook reiterated that his ultimate mission, Howard's ultimate mission, is to protect the Americans and the residents of Arizona from the Indians, not to show unbridled favoritism towards the Apache, who terrorized these Americans you're supposed to protect. Crook then said, quote, "General Howard, many of these people have lost their friends, relatives, and property by these Indians. They carry their lives constantly in their hands, not knowing what moment is to be their last. Now, if instead of affording relief, you not only fail to give it to them, but outrage their feelings besides, you must not expect your position to shield you from hearing plain words. These people have suffered too much to have any false ideas of sentiment." End quote. Paul Andrew Hutton wrote about the aftermath of this meeting when he wrote, quote, "Crook took considerable satisfaction upon learning that his remarks had so disturbed Howard that he could not sleep until he found relief in prayer at 3 o'clock in the morning. Howard was a good man, doing the best he knew how to do in an exceedingly difficult situation. The general had gone away from camp to sit alone and pray beneath the spectacular canopy of stars offered by the Arizona night sky. He found his answer." End quote. That's the power of prayer for you right there. The answer the Lord gave Howard to this problem with the kidnapped children who had been taken by the participants in the massacre, at least the children who were not with the O'odham in Mexico, because a lot of them had been sold into slavery, unfortunately. Howard's answer, or the Lord's answer to Howard, which he received, was that these children would all be turned over to the Catholic wife of a sergeant at Camp Grant, at least until President Grant himself would make the ultimate decision on what to do. Also, with regards to Whitman, he would be forced to resign from his post by Howard. Crook would court-martial him a third time, and he would be removed from Arizona. So I guess he didn't used to fail upwards back then. Howard would, shortly after the meeting, he would leave Arizona, and with him he took quite a few Indian chiefs from various bands and even other tribes. He would take them back east to D.C. Some of the people that accompanied him were leaders from the Pimas, the Papagos, the Yavapai, 2 Aravaipa Apaches, and 2 White Mountain Apaches. Both of those bands of Apaches are Western Apache. The names of the Apaches were the aforementioned Santos, a guy named Old Pedro, Esqueltecella, and Miguel. Escabinzin had been invited, but he had refused to go. So they all loaded up wagons and horses and rode to Santa Fe before pushing further north towards Pueblo, Colorado. Once there, they boarded a train to the east, towards the capital of the White Eyes Empire. How did the train ride go for the Apaches? I'm glad you asked. Roberts gives this somewhat humorous anecdote from the trip. He wrote, quote, "When Howard bade them climb aboard a passenger car, their fear intensified. As the train began to move, the Indians hid on the floor and covered their faces with their hands. Howard tried to reassure them, and soon they were sitting upright and staring out the window." End quote. I imagine riding a train for the first time, probably after seeing a train for the first time. I'm pretty sure that was a jarring experience. During the train ride, Howard noticed curiously that the Apaches were counting the mountains as they passed by them. This was probably something they'd been doing for centuries throughout the region as they navigated their vast Apacheria landscape, navigating it with precision accuracy. I remember reading a certain book about the Comanche, which will not be named, and the author talked about how the Comanche knew every single rock and tree on the landscape from Colorado to Mexico. And I'm pretty sure the Apache had the same lexicon of geographical knowledge as well. But eventually, after counting all those mountains, one of the White Mountain Apaches, a man with one eye on account of losing the other during combat, well, this one-eyed Apache man was Miguel. And Miguel told Howard in a resigned voice that he could no longer count the mountains, for there were too many. Therefore, he was going to have to rely solely on the White Eyes General to lead him back to his own home. It sounds trivial, but for such an independent people, it must have been a kind of defeat in its own way. But that was the point of the whole trip. For years, and not just with the Apache and other southwestern tribes, but for years the federal government, before and after the Civil War, they have been regularly and with increasing frequency, they have been taking chiefs and warriors and prominent Indians back to the east. They have been taking them back east to demoralize them, to show them, hey, look how many of us there are. Look at our cargo. Look at our strength. We will never stop coming. Resistance is futile. On this trip, though, Howard took the Apache and other various tribes to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York City, among some other locales. And they would show off the bustling and growing American empire. These Western Indians would see the buildings, the parks, the people, the shipyards. That's a big one. The shipyards that had countless people unloading from the vessels which stretched in a line far out to sea. These Indians were given food and things and cargo, and cargo is the best word I can describe it. They were just bribes. And cargo is what the Apache had been stealing and raiding for centuries now. And look how much the Americans had of it. But in New York City, the coup de grace came when that one-eyed Apache Miguel came back to the group with 2 eyes. He had been fitted and given a glass one. The group of Western Apache were amazed. The Apache also met with President Grant, who gave them a medal and $50 each. They were also escorted to a school for the deaf and mute, and that was in Washington, D.C. That school is now known as Gallaudet College. At first I wasn't sure why on earth Howard would take these Apache and other Indians to a school for disabled people. But then I realized, duh. It was to show these Apache, who also cared for their disabled, that the White Eyes had compassion and love for everyone, whether it be the impaired or the Indian. At this school, though, the Apaches, who were closer to their ancestors' ways than, say, the O'odham, who had been Christianized long ago and agriculturalized, The Apache, while at this school, almost immediately created a sign language which these deaf students could understand, which just goes to show how ubiquitous Universal Indian Sign Language was. Even wide eyes could understand it. Miguel especially loved the experience and talked to the students about the land and the animals and the plants way out in the American Southwest. Obviously, the students were fascinated. They'd probably never seen a cactus. Also, during the trip, though, the Indian men from the West were shown the darker side of white civilization. The side these Apache may just end up on if they continued to fight. Howard rather geniusly showed the Indians a prison in Pennsylvania. And I will let Roberts share that story for y'all. Perhaps the most frightening episode on the Eastern Tour was a visit to a Pennsylvania penitentiary. Howard observed the Indians' deep dismay and compassion for the inmates, without recognizing its source. For an Apache, to be locked in a cage was the most hideous of punishments, worse than the cruelest torture. Miguel knew. He had spent a year in a Santa Fe prison for a crime he said he had not committed. End quote. For roadrunners, this does not come as a surprise. It's why the Apaches with the Apache Kid resisted when they were arrested. Prison was worse than death. The Apache Kid and his cohorts were absolutely not going to Florida, or worse, Alcatraz. Being confined to a reservation, by the way, was seen by the Apache as a form of prison. But the message that was pounded upon these Apache, that message being assimilate or be destroyed, it did indeed lead to some lasting conversions. In New York State, at a Presbyterian church, the other White Mountain Apache, not Miguel, but an Apache named Old Pedro, he stood up in front of the church and he declared his everlasting conversion. He told everyone in Apache that he became a saved Indian. He would say to the congregation, which was interpreted to them, that, quote, "You have schools, churches, places where clothes are made, houses filled with wealth. You have wagons, horses, railroad cars, and more than I can speak of. We have nothing. We are very poor. I have been thinking hard. We had, long ago, all the land. The Indians were once as one man. Now they are divided, and the white men have all the land and all things. Now, I am going to be a white man. I shall wear the white man's clothes. I shall cook and eat the white man's food. And I want my children to go to school and learn to be white men." End quote. As I mentioned earlier, this was the intended outcome of the entire endeavor in bringing these Indians to the East. Force them to understand that resistance was worthless. Roberts writes of this tactic, quote, "The theory behind the practice of taking prominent Indians back east, which had begun long before Howard's 1872 jaunt, was that these ambassadors would be overwhelmed by the sheer size and might of the United States and dazzled by its technological accomplishments. The Indians would thus lose the heart to fight on against impossible odds, and would also come to envy and then to emulate white ways. Once back home, their testimony to what they had seen would ripple through their people, multiplying the impact of the visit 100-fold. End quote. Crook himself had used this tactic in his speech against the Pitt River Indians earlier. Howard was using it now. But other Americans used a similar method on other Indians, using the newest technology instead of transportation. That technology being photography. In a 2002 book called Scalp Dance, Indian Warfare on the High Plains, author and historian Thomas Goodrich talks about a meeting between a Kiowa Indian named Bearstooth and the whites. It's a devastating anecdote that highlights the despair that many Indians felt when they were confronted with the fact that the wave of whites coming across the continent and into their lands was not a rogue wave, but merely the first in a never-ending series of them that would flood the land slowly like a rising tide. No matter how many waves you beat back, the next one was still coming, and they were never ceasing. A man named Thomas Batty, he showed pictures of the East to the Kiowas, pictures with cities and roads and buildings, the massive amounts of people, pictures of soldiers. The same thing that Howard showed these Western Indians, but Howard showed them in person. But Thomas Batty showed these Plains Indians pictures of the thriving and growing life back east. And these pictures completely demoralized the Indian leaders who viewed the photographs. As I mentioned earlier, various American Indians had been escorted east regularly for years, and upon their return to the West and its wilderness, they were always demoralized and distraught at the sheer numbers of white people they witnessed. But the other Indians who hadn't seen the spectacle themselves, they simply refused to believe it. Or they assumed that their Indian brethren had been cursed or some witch had gotten a hold of their friends. But then the camera came along. Thomas Batty, quoted in this book, Scalp Dance, he writes of the scene he witnessed after he presented the Indians with these pictures. Quote, "One middle-aged man who has always treated these reports with the utmost skepticism was particularly struck with them. He could not sufficiently express his surprise, but beat upon his mouth in utter astonishment. Sunboy, who had often told him what he saw in the East, would say to him in Kiowa, 'What do you think now? You think all lie now? You think all chiefs who have been to Washington fools now?' Again and again would he look them over with his hand upon his mouth, dumb with amazement. After he had looked them over several times, being a war chief, he called in his warriors and exhibited the pictures to them, talking to them all the time. I could understand but a part, yet would gather such expressions as these. 'Look, see what a mighty powerful people they are. We are fools. We don't know anything. We are just like wolves running wild on the plains.'" End all quotes. It's a heartbreaking statement that this Kiowa war chief exclaims. We are like wolves running wild on the plains. Little did these Kiowa know that the wolves would soon be extinct from the Great Plains. After the trip, the one-eyed, glass-eyed Miguel, sadly, after this eastward odyssey, he would be killed during a quote-unquote petty Indian outbreak. Howard, despite his successful jaunt east with the other Apache and southwestern Indians, he was not at all finished with his work. There was one Apache he had not been able to meet that he desperately felt he needed to. There was one Apache who had refused to meet with Howard, refused to go east, and refused to settle down at Tularosa. There was one Apache who refused to allow he and his people to be subjugated. That man was Cochise. Cochise, though, had not been seen by Americans in 5 months, at least not by any living Americans. Raids still occurred in southern Arizona through the remainder of 1872, and it is possible that some of them were carried out by the old warrior, but certainly not all of them. Crook waited and fumed in Arizona the entire time Howard was gone to the east. It was humiliating being told to sit on your hands while your superior literally paraded your enemy through the capital. But Crook had his orders, and he had to wait for Howard to return before he could mount his grand offensive. But in the meantime, he did ramp up his recruitment of Apache Scouts. By December 2nd, 1872, Crook and Bourke, who had been tasked with the job of recruiting, they had 47 mostly White Mountain Apache Scouts enlisted, including one very peculiar, one-eyed, red-haired, copper-colored half-Apache Bourke would call Mickey Free. That's right. The kidnapped boy Felix, a.k.a. Mickey Free, would, by 1872, be a scout in the U.S. Army. And he'd be described in 1880 as a mean SOB and a, quote, indolent creature. A more repulsive object could not be imagined, end quote. So indolent is another word for lazy. That is not necessarily high praise of the man. Mickey Free let his red hair grow long, and it covered up his missing eye, while the other eye viewed everything with distrust and disgust, seemingly. Roberts, in Once They Moved Like the Wind, describes him eloquently when he wrote, quote, "Perhaps like Shakespeare's Iago, he nursed a secret wound, a hatred of the world instilled by the wrongs done him in his youth, which drove him to return the harm, just for the pleasure of watching things fall apart around him." End quote. So Iago is the main antagonist in Shakespeare's Othello, and he sets the play in motion by harboring a hatred of the main character, Othello. He's been described as Shakespeare's most sinister villain, and that's on account of his closeness to the protagonist, Othello, who he ruins. English literary scholar and Shakespeare specialist A.C. Bradley said that, quote, "Evil has nowhere else been portrayed with such mastery as in the evil character of Iago." End quote. Like that character, Mickey Free would betray seemingly everyone from the Apache to the Americans in both big and small ways. And he'd seemingly enjoy every second of it. Some men just want to watch the world burn. Roberts suggests that Jimmy Ward, Mickey Free's stepfather, he suggests he was a drunk and a not-so-beloved man by the community. He says Ward beat the poor kid, which is why he possibly went willingly with the one-eyed Mexican Apache, Beto. Beto had kidnapped him all those years ago, but maybe he went willingly. Mickey Free may actually be half Mexican, half Apache himself, since his mother may have been raped by an Apache man during a raid, and that terrible violence is what formed him. Although no one knows how he acquired the red hair. Mickey Free obviously wasn't Felix's Christian name or Apache name, but seeing as how the American officers couldn't pronounce most of the Apache names, they would appoint the men a new name when they signed up to become scouts. Most of this naming was done by Bourke at this time, who again was in charge of their recruitment, the scouts. But Bourke said of these names, quote, like the names that he gave them, he said, quote, "They struck everybody as being full of significance and perfectly appropriate at the time they were bestowed." End quote. Some of the names of these scouts included Dandy Jim, Dutchie, Peaches, Buckshot, the Apache Kid, and Mickey Free. The Apaches couldn't pronounce Anglo names either, and they named Bourke Nantan Hostajul, or Captain Cactus, which I love. So why Mickey Free? Well, Captain Cactus thought that the strange and angry red-haired man looked somewhat Irish, and Mickey Free was a colorful character in a popular 1840 Irish novel, a novel by Charles Lever, called Charles O'Malley, the Irish Dragon. Apparently, Mickey Free was a main character in that very popular military romance novel, except that character was dashing and handsome, and Felix the kidnapped boy was... Well, I'll have a picture of him up on the website. He is indeed kind of scary looking. So all the military men and officers at camp that were literate, they knew of the character and they would laugh at the inside joke, which Mickey Free could not understand and probably would never understand. So his name and his appearance made him extremely popular among the Anglos. Meanwhile, if you'll remember, he remained quite unpopular with the Chiricahua Apache, who called him the, quote, coyote whose kidnapping had brought war to the Chiricahua, end quote. Before he signed up, he was indeed a coyote. He was an Apache. He participated in raids. He later claimed and even bragged about killing women and children. He believed he was Apache. I talked about in the last episode how he trained to become a warrior with his adopted Apache brethren. He lived and hunted and raided, and he fought like an Apache. but now he was training to fight like a White Eyes. But as Hutton puts it, quote, Mickey Free would find the transformation back into the white world to be far more difficult than his transformation into an Apache. End quote. The fight he and others were training for under Crook, it was about to commence. Mickey Free wasn't the only scout under Crook that was about to go to war. Two other names I've mentioned a good bit before, Grijalva and Sieber, were also trusted scouts in Arizona. Sieber featured heavily in my Apache Kid series for Roadrunners that everyone should sign up and listen to. Sieber would eventually become head of the Apache Scouts in Arizona at San Carlos. But for this offensive, he would be in charge of the Yavapai Indians. Sieber was born in the 1840s in Germany, but after the failed 1848 Commie Revolution throughout Europe that his brother had fought in, the family fled to the United States. Like so many other failed commies and Reds of that decade, and yes, they would move to the East Coast from Italy, France, and Germany, and they would indeed influence policy and politics in this very country in the wrong direction. But that is not my wheelhouse. After Sieber's family fled Germany, they arrived to the United States, but by the 1850s, Sieber himself, he was in Minneapolis. At least until the Civil War started. He would obviously fight for the North, and he really would fight. He'd be in quite a few major battles before falling at Gettysburg when a shell exploded near his head. And then as he was falling, a bullet tore through his right leg. So that injury and bullet put him out of action, even though he stayed in the military until the war ended. He then headed back to Minneapolis, but before long, he was heading out west. First to California, and then to Prescott, where he not only became a foreman on a ranch, but he also met an old school scout veteran by the name of Dan O'Leary. And Dan O'Leary would teach Al everything he'd later be famous for. This ranch he worked on, it was northwest of Prescott, some 20 miles. And the road between the town and the ranch was an extremely dangerous one. It was frequently the target of both the Yavapai and Tonto Apache raids. In 1868 alone, 18 men were killed on that very stretch of road. And, interesting fact, for a while there, the Army thought the Yavapai were Apache. They even called them Yavapai Apache. But they are, in fact, not the same. They're not both Athabascan. Even though there is still today at Verde Valley, a Yavapai Apache reservation. A reservation which founding we're about to hear about. Sieber was described by people who knew him as a hard-drinking, fast-tempered, and highly able-bodied Indian fighter. At some point, he would end up living with the Apache, and while doing so, he'd come to respect them and their warfare. But he'd also come to think like them as well. Although he had no qualms, apparently, killing Apache, and the Apache understood this, and they feared him for this. Sieber's biographer would later claim that he would see action, quote, in more Indian fights than Daniel Boone, Jim Bridges, and Kit Carson together. End quote. He would possibly kill more than 100 hostile Indians throughout his long career, and he would be wounded a staggering 29 times. Eventually, he would sign on at Camp Verde in Arizona, where before long, he would become the chief of scouts. A Lieutenant Britton Davis would say about Sieber, quote, if there ever was a man who actually did not know physical fear, that man was Sieber. End quote. The other chief of scouts I just mentioned was Grijalva, and his name has come up occasionally in the past couple episodes. The man was a norteño, a Mexican from Sonora. But at 10 years old, he had been captured by the Chiricahua Apaches, who then raised him in their ways, much like they did with Mickey Free and many others. The Apache looked after him for 8 years, during which time Grijalva had gone on raids against Anglos and Mexicans. He had become an Apache warrior. But at 18, he escaped to an American fort in Arizona. And by 1866, he was a guide and interpreter for the army. And he was now hunting his once adopted Apache family. Incredibly, Grijalva's Chiricahua kidnappers were closely allied to Cochise's band, and he had one time seen the warrior chief, Cochise, drive his lance through an Apache's heart when the Apache warrior had brought Cochise some horses that were branded with U.S. Army on them. Cochise didn't want that kind of heat. He didn't want the heat that U.S. Army mules and horses brought, so Cochise just killed this Apache warrior right there on the spot. Obviously, this kind of intimate knowledge made Grijalva invaluable. He had the best knowledge of the Apache, and he could track them as well as the Apache tracked the U.S., the Army. Roberts writes of him, quote, "He knew Cochise's people so well that he once identified them from moccasins and beadwork that had been seized from a deserted camp." End quote. This made the man especially hated by the Chiricahua Apache, and they thought of him as the ultimate traitor. There is no doubt he always kept an extra bullet for himself if he were ever captured by Cochise or any Apache. So clearly Grijalva was indispensable to this coming assault. Crook really liked his heads of scouts. He couldn't very well use educated Anglo army officers in the role of head of Indian scouts. He had to use frontier men. He had to use men who better understood the skills needed in the wilderness. Men who had the ability to communicate with the Indians. That was also a plus. In an earlier era, as Roberts suggested, these men would have been mountain men and fur trappers. And indeed, many of them started out as fur trappers. But then they had to move on when the beaver were all trapped out or warfare overtook them. Many times, these men were half-breeds themselves, and most of them would have at some point an Indian squaw wife, or 2, or 3. These men lived in 2 worlds and worked well in both of them. And it helped that they had no qualms with killing. Another future chief of Apache Scouts is a man named Tom Horn, who I mentioned in my Apache Kid series and the Pleasant Valley War episode. And he is soon getting his own Roadrunner exclusive series. Crook's deadline for this offensive, which everyone was gearing up for, the deadline was November 15th, 1872. Any and all Apache found outside of the established reservations, as Crook himself put it, were to be relentlessly pursued and destroyed, quote, in one good dose, instead of in a number of petty engagements, but in either case were to be hunted down until the last one in hostility had been killed or captured. End quote. Now, of course, women and children were to be taken prisoner, not killed, and all prisoners were to be treated well. Crook then further gave the order that any of these imprisoned Apaches who wanted to enlist to be a scout should be allowed to do so. They should even be encouraged to do so. Because as he put it, quote, the wilder the Apache was, the more he was likely to know of the wiles and stratagems of those still out in the mountains. End quote. Crook demanded this operation be, quote, short, sharp, and decisive. End quote. He meant business. And his business would include 9 columns in the field at one time, and all 9 of them would be hunting Apaches in every quote-unquote nook and corner of Arizona Apacheria. During the marches through the wilderness, the men were given strict orders that no one was to sing or to whistle, shout, or even strike a match. On rocky ground, they switched out their boots for moccasins. They could only have fires if they were small and if the officers and scouts gave them the okay. This was going to be hard, cold, rotten, devilish, and dangerous work. It was exactly what soldiers signed up to do. Finally, the deadline arrived. November 15th turned into the 16th, and that very morning saw 3 cavalry columns depart from Camp Yavapai. The offensive had begun. Each column had a number of cavalry troops and 30 scouts. These scouts from Camp Yavapai were either Yavapai or Mojave. Sieber himself led 30 Yavapais, and they were to search every canyon and peak from Prescott to Flagstaff. And that included the Chino Valley and the headwaters of the Verde River. Meanwhile, 2 other columns left a place known as Camp Date Creek. And as they left, the camp would immediately and forever close behind them. Crook then headed to Camp Apache to recruit more scouts and to put yet another column in the field. Once he'd arrived on November 29th, he met with the camp's commander, a man named Captain George Jake Randall, and the two of them began to plan their column's offensive maneuvers. The plan they came up with was that Captain Randall was to head west along the Salt River towards Fort McDowell, which is not too far northwest of Phoenix. With Randall would be a detachment of Apache Scouts led by a Corridon Coolie. Each unit would be given a packed train of mules, of course. And Crook said of this engagement, quote, "While they were sufficiently large to prevent disaster, they were small enough to slip around out of sight of the hostiles." End quote. He had planned the whole thing to a T. Randall was actually quite liked by the White Mountain Apache, who called him Nantan Jake, or Nantan Black Mustache. As for Corridon Coolie, he'd been born in Virginia in 1836, but he made it out to New Mexico by 1856, so at 20 years old. And then, when the war started, he fought with Kit Carson and the Union. He had been at Fort McLean when Mangus Coloradus was murdered, actually. He then headed over to Arizona when a boom happened, and while there he married 2 Apache women, one named Cora and one named Molly, and they both were the daughter of a chief named Pedro. Kind of weird. But it made him pretty tight with the White Mountain Apaches, the same White Mountain Apaches he was now chief of scouts of. And I believe it's the same Pedro that had gone east in that story with Howard. Once Bourke and Crook had to leave to make preparations at Fort Grant, they put a man named Lieutenant Alexander Brody in charge. This man would later become one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. He'd also later be territorial governor of Arizona. So now Randall, Brody, Cooley, and 47 Apache Scouts were ready to head out into the field with Randall's small column. And one of these Apache Scouts would be Mickey Free. Randall and the gang's main target were a group of Tonto Apaches led by a man named Delshay, or Red Ant. And he was as mean as his name suggests. Hutton writes of him, quote, "The chief was one of the most successful fighters in the mountains, so much so that he had disdained to talk peace with either Collier or Howard." End quote. Well, Crook, using Randall and his men as his tool, Crook was not asking to talk to Red Ant. Crook had previously called the man the Liar. That was the name he gave Delshay, or Red Ant. He said Delshay had, quote, "the worst reputation amongst all the Indians for villainy and devilment." End quote. Villainy and devilment. That's a good alternate title for this episode. The Apache Scouts were more than happy to make war against Red Ant, too. for the Chiricahua had been known to go on raids against them and even capture some of their women. Red Ant, for his part, was not afraid to stand up for his Tonto Apache people, which, standing up, led to many battles and fights between the two Apache factions. And this is exactly why Crook was using the Chiricahua as scouts to begin with. He was playing off of this animosity. On December 10th, 1872, the army came knocking on Red Ant's mound. That morning, 8 soldiers and 20 scouts, with Mickey Free included, they waged a small 2-hour battle which would see 14 Tontos killed. The attachment then burned the rancheria to the ground. Red Ant and most of his people would escape, but they would do so without any food and without most of their stolen mules, and they were now down many a warrior. 3 days later, in a repeat, Mickey Free, the other scouts, and the 8 soldiers that were with them killed another 11 Tontos of a different band, and this time they captured 6 adult women and a child. After this win, the usually pretty colorful and almost always vocally anti-Apache newspaper, the Arizona Weekly Miner, even they gave the Apache Scouts some praise when they wrote, quote, "The friendly Indians, too, deserve the thanks of all good Americans." End quote. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bourke was absolutely beaming with praises of his boss's wisdom in hiring the Apache Scouts. He would go on to say, quote, "The longer we knew the Apache Scouts, the better we liked them. They were wilder and more suspicious than the Pimas and Maricopas, but far more reliable and endowed with a greater amount of courage and daring." End quote. I mean, everyone who's listened to the previous episodes know the Apache are not in any way lacking courage or daring. Remember that 1660 quote by the Spanish missionary that said the Apache, quote, "hurl themselves at danger like a people who know no God, nor that there is any hell." End quote. That's what they were doing here, against their own Apache cousins. The very next year after these engagements, the year being 1873, a Lieutenant Walter Scribner Schuler would comment on that, quote, "An Apache only knows 2 emotions, fear and hate." End quote. In these engagements with their fellow Apache, they proved themselves full of hate. That minor battle, the first encounter of Randall's men against the Tontos, well, one day after that, on December 11th, a different column that had been sent out by Crook, this one was led by William H. Brown. He had led his 5th Cavalry and 30 Apache Scouts, as well as Captain Bourke, because Captain Bourke was eager to see some action. They were all headed towards infamy and a place known ominously as Skeleton Cave. Brown's 30 Apache Scouts were led by a man named Archie McIntosh, and McIntosh was Crook's favorite head of scouts. McIntosh had been born in Ontario, up in Canada. He had a Scottish father and a Chippewa Indian mother. He was pretty savvy when it came to the wilderness, which makes sense. He had started trapping when he was 10 years old, but he was also a survivor. When McIntosh was just a wee lad, he was in a canoe with his father up in Canada, trapping the Fraser River, when Indians ambushed he and his dad and put an arrow into his father, killing him instantly. Young Archie McIntosh was able to escape, though. After that, he was sent to Scotland to gain an education, but before long he'd be back in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, where he would not only work for the Hudson Bay Company, but he would be a guide and interpreter for the U.S. Army. And he had that job by 1855. One of the reasons Crook liked him so much was because McIntosh, in Idaho some years before, McIntosh had guided Crook through a blinding blizzard, which saved Crook's life. So Crook trusted the man. He trusted the man with his life, and he learned to trust the guide's instincts. The only problem with McIntosh, a problem Crook forgave, but the only problem with the half-Scot, half-Indian was his propensity for being a raging drunk. It was a well-known fact that occasionally he'd have to be propped up on his horse, which then would lead the way while he was passed out. Sometimes he woke up in the back of a wagon after having fallen off his horse. When Crook brought him from the Pacific Northwest to the American Southwest, during that journey, that long journey in the summer of 1871, the journey that saw the two and a few others go all the way from Portland, Oregon to Tucson, McIntosh, for the entire journey, was rip-roaring drunk. I mean, a lot of that was because he didn't want to go to the desert, but once he was there, he proved to be an invaluable leader of Apache Scouts. He had actually led Crook on that first mission through the Tonto's land, where the Tonto Apache had jumped off the Mogollon Rim after narrowly getting an arrow into Crook's noggin. So Brown, Bourke, McIntosh, and the Scouts, they were also in search of Red Ant, but instead of finding that Tonto Apache, they came upon a large group of Yavapai who were camped out in the Salt River Canyon. The confusion came about because an Indian, I'm not sure what band or tribe of Indian, but an Indian told Crook and Bourke that Red Ant was in a cave stronghold in the Mazatzal Mountains, and they sit high above the Salt River. This area today is just west of the Roosevelt Dam near Tonto National Monument, a monument which bears the name of the Apache, but it houses Mogollon ruins, who may have been actually chased out by the Apache. Another scout also told Crook and Bourke that not only is that the stronghold, that cave stronghold, but this Indian was raised in the cave, and he can take them directly to Red Ant. The date was December 28th, and the battle that ensued was not a battle at all, but was instead a massacre. A bloodbath that would be known as the Skeleton Cave Massacre. Sadly, many of these Yavapai had actually, like earlier in the same year, they'd already been on a reservation. They'd already surrendered. They'd already lived as the White Eyes wanted them to. But while at the reservation, many got malaria or got sick from the food rations, so they left. They went back to these mountains and out of sight of the whites, which would obviously have dire consequences. That very early morning in late December, Bourke and 220 soldiers with a bunch of Pima O'odam and Maricopa scouts, they ascended the landscape towards the opening of the cave and completely surprised the inhabitants. Led by around a dozen snipers, the men came to the opening of the cave where they saw warriors dancing around a fire while women were preparing food. Here's how Roberts describes what unfortunately happened next. There was no discussion of surrender. In the morning gloom, each sharpshooter chose a warrior. At the whispered signal, all fired. 6 of the Yavapai men fell dead. Hearing the gunfire, the rest of the army patrol came running up. A broken wall of boulders ranged across the front of the cave. At once, the Yavapai warriors sprang to positions behind these rocks and started shooting at the soldiers, while the women, children, and old men cowered inside the cave. There was no hope of flight, for the soldiers had the cave surrounded. The commander now, according to Bourke, quote, directed his interpreters to summon all to an unconditional surrender, end quote. Apache scouts yelled out the appeal. The only answer was a shriek of hatred and defiance, reported Bourke. Threats of what we had to expect, yells of exultation at the thought that not one of us should ever see the light of another day, but should furnish a banquet for the crows and buzzards. End all quotes. The Yavapai would indeed fight back until they ran out of ammunition and arrows. At one point, 20 warriors rushed the soldiers with what weapons remained, but they were all killed or pushed back. Then, Bourke sent a small group of soldiers up onto a ledge that overlooked the cave, where they were told to push every boulder they could onto the people below, which they did. And it was absolutely devastating. The survivors within the cave then fled to the back of the cave where, out of fight and out of hope, they cowered in the darkness. But that would not help them. The troops and the scouts were then directed to fire at the ceiling and the cave walls, where the bullets would bounce and ricochet into the huddled Indians. The lead finished the job as the pinging bullets killed indiscriminately. As the troops slowly made their way into the cave, the O'odam were reported by a Yavapai survivor as bashing the heads in of any survivors with rocks before the soldiers could stop them. After the dust cleared, the cave was filled with 76 dead Yavapai men, women, and children. Only 20 women and children, and almost all of them wounded, would be taken captive. That same Yavapai survivor would also say, quote, "One woman who was badly wounded and could not sit on a horse was left behind. Some soldiers gave her food and water, but when they were out of sight, some Pimas went back and mashed her head to jelly." End quote. 61 years later, the bleached and broken bones were still strewn about the cave and its opening. Eventually, a party of Yavapai came and gathered what remained and buried them at Fort McDowell. But the ricochet marks the bullets made on the cave walls and ceiling, they can still be seen today. Crook was satisfied with the quote-unquote battle's success. Although he was disappointed Red Ant had not been among those crushed or shot to death. In the second week of January, 1873, Captain Randall had his men and his Apache Scouts right back out in the field. Winter, after all, was on the Army's side. Hutton writes of the winter, quote, "The cold was his," meaning Crook. "The cold was his ally, for it hampered movement by the Apache warriors, encumbered their families, and prevented them from replenishing their food supplies." Hutton goes on, "Crook counted on winter snow to provide his mobile strike forces and their pack trains with enough water. This was a risky gamble, but it would pay off for him." End quote. This area that Crook was fighting in, the Tonto Basin area, it reaches heights of 8,000 feet, and the Apache were sure to stay at the highest possible elevations so that they could hide and escape capture. But up there they couldn't build fires because those fires would give away the Apaches' positions. Not to mention all the food they would be eating over the campaign had to have been gathered in the fall. So if an encampment was discovered and the people had to run, they would lose all of their stored up foods. So in January, Randall sent Brody with 44 men and Apache Scouts back out in the field. Their mission was to clear out the land south of the White Mountains of any remaining Apache. They were also to establish Camp Grant at a different location. And this new location would be 2 miles west of Mount Graham, which is across the Gila River. Mount Graham is northeast of Tucson and straight north of the town of Wilcox, which is on I-10. Crook sent them in there to specifically locate and destroy Cochise and his band. Or as Crook put it, quote, "Iron all the wrinkles out of Cochise's band." End quote. As the Skeleton Cave Massacre showed, the Apache weren't the only ones in need of rounding up, according to Crook and the U.S. Army. The Yavapai were also refusing to come in, and they needed to be shown the way. So after a month of scouring the wilderness of southern Arizona, with nothing to show for it, Randall caught a break when he came upon Brown's 5th Cavalry. They had very recently fought a small engagement with the Yavapai, which resulted in 3 of their women being captured. Randall then interrogated these women, and eventually they gave up the location of their main rancheria, or mountain stronghold. Randall, being the ranking commander, he took charge and ordered everyone to assault this mountain fortress stronghold. But ahead of the large group were the scouts, and with those scouts was Mickey Free. They were looking for a spot known as Turret Peak. And I'm actually going to let Hutton describe what happens next in all of its harrowing details. Quote, Randall's troopers followed the scouts on foot, with gunny sacks wrapped over their boots to muffle the sound. It was tough going over sharp lava rock studded with cactus, and Mickey and the scouts had to physically pull several of the exhausted men up over the rocks. Through the darkness, they could make out Turret Peak looming above them. The rancheria, Mickey reported, was on the circular mesa that marked the top of the mountain. Randall's men struck at dawn on March 27th. The surprise was total. As Mickey and the scouts swept through the compact rancheria, the inhabitants fled toward the waiting soldiers and were shot down or captured. Some jumped off the cliff in an attempt to escape. A few managed to hide in the brush, but many simply hurled themselves into eternity in a blind leap for freedom. All 33 warriors encountered were killed, while 13 women and children were rounded up by the scouts. End quote. 2 days later, on March 29th, 1873, Randall and his troopers and his scouts, they all returned triumphantly to Camp Verde with their prisoners. Now at the fort, Brody promoted a few of the Apache scouts, including Mickey Free. Mickey Free was now a corporal. Obviously, after that success, a war dance was enjoyed by the Apache, and with them, it was recorded, some of the White Eyes joined in. It was a celebration of a long winter campaign having been successfully completed. Apparently, Turret Peak was thought of by the Apache and Yavapai. Both of them, they thought the place was impregnable. Its downfall was, as Hutton put it, the final straw. The Apache were tired of running. They had been cold and hungry all winter, and Crook's soldiers were everywhere all the time. They were impossible to escape. It was impossible to be a free Apache. By mid-April, 1,200 Yavapai and Tonto Apache had come into the new Fort Grant. Individuals, families, and eventually bands all surrendered and came in from the literal and figurative cold. The war had been a success. Crook himself was at the fort to greet many of the surrendering Indians. One of the Yavapai chiefs even told Crook that, quote, "You see, we are all nearly dead from want of food and exposure. The copper cartridge has done the business for us. I am glad of the opportunity to surrender, but I do it not because I love you, but because I am afraid of General." End quote. I mean, that had been, after all, General Crook's stated aim. That was his desire from the onset of hostilities. I mean, these were the quote-unquote renegade Apache, and he was going to bring them in. He was out to prove there was no escaping the future. And that future was a non-stop onslaught of never-ending Anglos pouring into the country to cultivate, civilize, and capitalize this desert Apacheria wilderness. Now again, the Yavapai are not Apache, but Apache were used as scouts. The Apache were there. Some Apache had fled and were living with the Yavapai. So the Yavapai are not Apache, even though at that time, again, the army thought that they were not. So the Yavapai play an important role in this story I'm telling, even though they are not Apache. On April 9th, 1873, Crook issued General Order 14, which officially ended the war against the Apache in Arizona. Although a few weeks later, the final coup de grace occurred when, on April 25th, Randall and his men ran into Red Ant, Delshay, the toughest renegade Tonto Apache of them all. But there was no fight. Red Ant waved the white flag, and then he and his people were all led into Camp Grant. General Crook said later that Red Ant told him, quote, "He had 125 warriors last fall, and if anybody had told him he couldn't whip the world, he would have laughed at them. But now he had only 20 left." End quote. By the end of the campaign, 2,300 Apache and Yavapai Indians were on various reservations in Arizona. Crook, when congratulating his men, said prematurely, in a very deck of an aircraft carrier, mission accomplished way, Crook had said they had done an outstanding job and that they, quote, "finally closed an Indian war that has been waged since the days of Cortez." End quote. The war against the Apache, though, it was not over. But this battle certainly was. That winter offensive really was an enormous military success. A success that could have gone wrong at any time throughout the widespread campaign. The chances of the men getting lost in the desert or the forest or the mountains, the chances of them getting ambushed, they were extremely high. But it did not happen. The bulk of this success must go to Crook himself, who planned everything down to the letter, including what straw to use on the pack mules' backs. He was also a lead from the front kind of commander. Bourke would write of him, quote, "There was no private soldier, no packer, no teamster who could down the old man in any work or outlast him on a march or a climb over the rugged peaks of Arizona. They knew that, and they also knew that in the hour of danger, Crook would be found on the skirmish line, and not in the telegraph office." End quote. Crook also kept his men in high spirits. It was remarked that several times after a long and hard day's march, Crook would just up and leave the camp with his shotgun, only to return before the morning with a pack full of game birds slung over his shoulder. His men would then get to enjoy the delicious fresh meat instead of the same old dried peaches, flour, beans, and bacon. On the other hand, the success for the U.S. Army meant utter and complete defeat for the Apache. In just one of these 9 columns, Bourke recorded over 500 Apache deaths. The Apache starved throughout the campaign, all throughout Arizona Apacheria. Diseases were widespread. Rancherias were burned to the ground. Many of the Apache spirits were broken. Many of them for a century. The sweeping and successful campaign was, in Robert's words, quote, "brutal in the extreme," and it, quote, "verged on the kind of genocidal persecution favored by Carleton and Baylor a decade before," end quote. Those were the Union and Confederate leaders of Arizona and New Mexico, respectively. I mean, apparently during the entire campaign, not a single surrender was recorded. That surrender of Red Ant was after the official declaration of it being over. Every engagement over the 140 days between the Army and the Apaches would end in violence, bloodshed, and death. The remainder of this success was absolutely on account of the Apache Scouts. They were always 1 or 2 days ahead of the main column, and they were supposed to trail the enemy, find the enemy, and then run back and tell the main force, who would then catch up and engage the enemy. But instead, these Apaches were so gung-ho and filled with fight that they'd just go ahead and engage the enemy whenever they came upon them. After Red Ant's surrender, he would tell either Randall or Crook, I'm not sure, but he would tell Crook himself and whomever he told, they would record, quote, He said they used to have no difficulty in eluding the troops, but now the very rocks had gotten soft. They couldn't put their foot anywhere without leaving an impression by which we could follow. That they could get no sleep at nights, for should a coyote or a fox start a rock rolling during the night, they would get up and dig out thinking it was we who were after them. End quote. The scouts were able to follow and track the Apache far better than the Mexicans and the Anglos, who were practically incapable of tracking. The scouts were the key to the mission's success. Mickey Free would re-enlist after his 6 months were up, and he would be promoted to sergeant. Other Apache scouts would receive the Medal of Honor. That's how important they were. So Crook's plan on using the Apache scouts had certainly paid off. And Mickey Free wouldn't be the only one getting a promotion. In October of that year, 1873, in a tidal wave of manifest destiny, the telegraph line was finally completed between Fort Yuma to the south and Prescott, which was the territorial capital. The first message sent over that line was from President Grant himself, who informed Crook that he had been promoted 2 grades higher to brigadier general. Arizonans were ecstatic in their support, and the Prescott Miner newspaper even called Crook the, quote, Napoleon of successful Indian fighters, end quote. But Crook still had not captured his ultimate goal. That goal was capturing the Napoleon of successful fighting Indians, Cochise. 2 episodes ago, I used Naiche, son of Cochise. I put Naiche's face on the famous painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps by Jacques-Louis David, except the background was the Mogollon Mountains of Mangus Colorados. Naiche apparently looked a lot like his father, so it's safe to say that Cochise looked like Naiche. So looking back, I probably should have saved that cover for this particular episode. I honestly had no idea the series would be this long. Yeah, surprise, surprise, right? So now, after explaining that big old campaign during the winter of 1872 and 1873, I'm going to back up a little, and we're going to catch back up with General Howard and the man of the hour, Cochise. So in the summer of 1872, in August, before the grand successful offensive, General Howard, the one-armed man, he returned to the American Southwest after his trip with the Indians on the East Coast. And with him, he brought his aide, Lieutenant Joseph Sladen. So Sladen had aided Howard both during the Civil War and during Howard's tenure at the Freedmen's Bureau. Their mission, by President Grant himself, was to make peace with the elusive Cochise. The first 2 runners sent out to ask for a parley, they were not successful in finding Cochise. So Howard, he decided he was going to go east to New Mexico to the newly established Fort Tularosa. And that is north of the Mogollon Mountains, where maybe he could meet with someone, anyone, who knew the elusive Apache chief. But before Howard even left, he was told that there was indeed a man amongst the Apache who knew Cochise. But this man was a white man, and that man's name is Tom Jeffords, Captain Tom Jeffords. The Apache called him Taglito, or Redbeard. I have an entire Roadrunner exclusive episode over the man's incredibly interesting life, which was released prior to this episode, and it is a great companion to this whole series. It talks a lot about the Apache and a lot about Cochise. Actually, really, all of the Roadrunner exclusives so far are good supplements to the Apache series, without me even meaning to do that. So if you want to hear that episode and the others, exclusives, subscribe at Substack, and you'll get a whole bunch more than that. Howard and Sladen were both warned to be leery of this white man, Tom Jeffords, who was friends with Cochise. He had been called a quote-unquote bad egg, and it was rumored that he was blood brothers with the Apache. He apparently even took Apache women home. It was rumored that he traded stolen stock, like livestock, for guns. He gave the Apache whiskey. He even may have raided down into Mexico with Cochise. The settlers believed Jeffords had white man's blood on his hands. None of those things were true, by the way, except for maybe the whiskey one, but that he didn't give it to them, he didn't sell it to them. He just shared his whiskey with them. Regardless, the always colorful Arizona press certainly pushed those rumors. By September of 1872, Howard and Sladen had made it to Fort Tularosa in New Mexico. And once there, they attempted again to meet with Cochise. But they knew that their only lifeline was Tom Jeffords, so they immediately sought him out, but he was nowhere to be found. But while the two were there, Howard and Sladen, and while they were waiting for Jeffords to show up, the two army men met with quite the plethora of Apache leaders. Apache leaders like the son of Mangus Coloradus, or just Mangus. They also met Nana, who we'll talk about later, Loco, and Victorio, who we'll also talk about later in future episodes. They also met with a couple other Apache men of note. And what did they learn from these Apache? They learned that the Apache at this ill-fated reservation, they hated Tularosa. While yes, it was beautiful, it simply wasn't their homeland. They felt no connection to the ground beneath them. Not to mention the winters were too cold, the water was bad, and the growing season was much too short. Also, the Apaches recorded that there were a lot of flies, too many flies, like tons of flies. And lastly, the place was home to a significant population of Mexican spotted owls. Well, that's cool, right? I mean, I'm a bird watcher now that I'm an old man. I would love to see some owls. But for the Chiricahua, the hoot of an owl was a bad omen. The hoot of an owl, it brought death. Tularosa then was filled with bad spirits and the promise that more spirits would arrive, their own. This whole reservation had been set up by Collier, who refused to give the Apache the land they wanted at Ojo Caliente. But, I mean, that's kind of because there were too many Hispanics already living there at the time. Collier didn't want to kick out the Hispanics out of their homes and fields, and he didn't want another violent eruption. As I said before, not moving the Apaches out of Tularosa sooner would have consequences for Victorio and his small band. The Apache leaders, though, they told Howard, especially Victorio, he told Howard, look, if you just relocate us 70 miles southeast to Cañada Alamosa, at least there, we will be happy. Heck, even Cochise camps there, and he would come in if you moved us to that spot, Cañada Alamosa, which is where they were before. It's near present-day Monticello, New Mexico, which is east of the Black Range, and it is west of Elephant Butte Lake and I-25. Howard would actually consider moving them back there, and I even read that he decided while at Tularosa to close the place down. He even set a date to travel to the spot Cañada Alamosa with Victorio. But for now, his main goal was peace with Cochise. And that goal grew closer when on September 7th, Jeffords arrived at camp. Jeffords wasn't in no hurry to meet with Howard, since he didn't like that Howard posed as a quote-unquote Christian soldier. And also, while Jeffords was friends with Cochise and the Apache, Jeffords wasn't too thrilled with Howard's quote-unquote well-known humanitarian ideas. Not to mention, Jeffords was a Democrat, not some loony Republican. Nonetheless, Howard was quick to find the red-bearded man whether he wanted to be found or not. And once found, Jeffords made quite the impression on the one-armed general. Howard wrote of meeting him, quote, "The first tent I entered, a tall, spare man with reddish hair and whiskers of considerable length, rose to meet me. He was pleasant and affable, and I was in the outset prepossessed in his favor." End quote. Howard, though, he got straight to business. He told Jeffords to send a message to Cochise saying that he, Howard, wanted to meet with him at once at the camp. Jeffords, though, he looked at Howard and told him, "No way. Cochise will not meet here. If you wish to talk to him, you must go to him." Howard then asked the man, who was apparently puffing on a cigar, he asked him, "Do you know where Cochise is?" Jeffords responded with, "Yeah, I can find him." Howard then asked if Jeffords could please take a message. But Jeffords said, "I'll do you one better." He said, quote, "General, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will take you to Cochise." End quote. Elated, Howard agreed to go with Jeffords at once. But Howard was told by Jeffords that he could take no soldiers with him. It had to be a small party, and he could only take his aide, Sladen. It would be dangerous, deadly even. Howard agreed. Jeffords would later say of Howard, quote, "I saw then that he was not only a brave man and fearless as far as his person was concerned, but was really in earnest about trying to stop the destructive war which Cochise was waging upon my countrymen." End quote. So Jeffords is friend with Cochise, but he is also a white man, and he does not like the war between the Apaches and the White Eyes. On September 13th, a group of Apache and Anglo men gathered at the fort, and they would leave for Cochise's stronghold. Among the Anglos were Howard, Sladen, and Jeffords, with Victorio, a bunch of his warriors, and Chia among the Apache. Chia was Cochise's nephew, and Cochise had raised Chia like his own son after Chia's father was hanged by Bascom immediately after the cutting of the tent, way back in Apache Pass in 1863. The incident which started this whole war. The incident which only happened after Beto stole the coyote boy Felix, a.k.a. Mickey, free. What tangled webs. The following journey is quite the saga in and of itself, with a lot of terrain covered and a lot of close calls, but the adventure would be well worth it. On their first night out, the small group camped near Ojo Caliente and Cañada Alamosa, where the following morning, Victorio would show Howard how important this land was to he and his Apaches. But again, the only problem was the nearby Hispanic settlement that did not want to share water or land with their ancient enemy, the Apache. Howard promised to talk to Washington about it upon his return to the capital, though. For his part, Howard would indeed talk to Washington, but the Indian Affairs Bureau refused to change the reservation's location. Even though he'd already said he would close Tularosa, there would be no res at Cañada Alamosa. After the tour of this beloved land, Victorio took his warriors back to Tularosa. Meanwhile, Howard's group continued in search of Cochise. At one point, an Apache man named Ponce was to meet them and take them to their leader. Ponce was possibly the son of Ponce, and the elder Ponce had been one of Cochise's closest friends. At least right up until he got murdered by another Apache in a drunken brawl in 1854. So there's that, or Ponce is another one of Mangus's many children. I'm not sure, I read both. But regardless, when Collier moved the res to Tularosa, Ponce refused to go. Therefore, he'd been raiding the countryside from the Rio Grande in central New Mexico to the Dragoon Mountains in southeastern Arizona. This put him right up against and intermingled with Cochise's Choconan territory. And this made Ponce one of Cochise's quote-unquote favorite friends. Jeffords said that once they met up with Ponce, he would take the group to the Cochise stronghold. Well, they certainly didn't have to wait too long, because only 12 miles south of the Cañada Alamosa camp, they ran right smack into Ponce, who was happy to see Taglito, a.k.a. Jeffords, his old friend. He also, surprisingly, told the General Howard that he and his people were coming in now if the general gave him a horse and promised to protect and feed his people. Howard agreed to both demands, which was yet another victory for the general. The following morning, Ponce showed up sans horse, since he was forced to give the horse to his wife, who was upset that he was leaving. Which, yeah, that's how it works sometimes. So Ponce led the group on foot, which apparently did not faze him, not even a little. Howard's aide, Sladen, would write that, quote, "On foot he went, and whether we traveled 20 miles up and down the rugged mountainside, it was all the same to Ponce." End quote. From there, the group traveled to Fort Bayard, and that is near Pinos Altos in the southern portion of the Mogollon Mountains. After Bayard, they traveled to Silver City. Silver City had only been established 2 years prior to them visiting. It was a brand new town, a mining town, which is still there. It was here at Silver City, though, where the group finally ran into some trouble. But it wasn't from the Apache. Rather, the trouble came from some angry prospectors. Silver City is a great town, directly south of Pinos Altos in the Mogollon Mountains. It is where Geronimo and Mangus Colorados were from. A lot of the action of previous episodes occurred around this area. And Silver City has a really amazing Members Pottery Museum that I encourage everyone who visits the area to go take a look at. It's at the university down there. Also, the hot springs in the mountains to the north are incredibly relaxing. So at Silver City, the group of Anglos with the 2 Apaches, they ran into some prospectors, and one of those prospectors had lost a brother to Cochise. So this man was none too pleased to see these Apache. Back in town, the prospector began to gather a posse. Howard, Sladen, and Jeffords, they eventually got word of this posse, so they made it a point to leave town as quickly as possible. I mean, remember, they were without a military escort, despite being in the military themselves, except Jeffords. It was just those 3 plus the 2 Apaches. A small party of 5, they were pretty vulnerable. So they left Silver City only to run into this now angry and armed posse right there on the road north. After some exchanged words, the slighted brother in the posse raised his rifle to shoot down the Apache, but heroically, Howard apparently stepped in front of the men and shouted, quote, "You will kill me first," end quote. That's a brave man indeed, really. After that, the posse dispersed with utterances of the quote-unquote damnable peace policy. Obviously, the 2 Apaches, Chia and Ponce, they were quite confused at what on earth they had just witnessed. So Jeffords had to explain to them that the White-Eyes General had just put his life on the line for these Apache men, for you. Apparently the 2 Apaches chuckled to themselves, but they would never forget the act and the courage it took, and they would also tell Cochise, which would make an impression on the old warrior as well. It was things like this that impressed the Apache, not a rolled-up piece of paper from Washington. Shortly after that drama, when they were 70 miles away from Cochise's mountain stronghold, either Chia or Ponce, I read both, but one of the Apaches abruptly halted the party built a small smoke signal, and then ran ahead of the group where he proceeded to howl like a coyote. Much to the Anglos' surprise, another coyote off in the distance responded. The Apache man then ran up a mountain only to return with one of Cochise's scouts. This man was a Chokonin Apache like Cochise, but his band leader was a man named Nazi, and he told them about where Cochise was, and then the group proceeded. So, the 3 Anglos of Howard, Sladen, and Jeffords, plus the 2 Apache, Chia and Ponce, the 5 of them were soon on their way west toward the Chiricahua Mountains, and now they were being led by this scout. This scout, by the way, had been trailing them for 2 days and 40 miles. Unbeknownst to Howard and Sladen, and probably Jeffords. And by now, as they grew closer to the mountain fortress, Sladen began to grow a little terrified. Howard, while urging him forward, was privately debating about sending him back. He would ultimately keep him around, though. When the adventurous crew reached Dos Cabezas and Apache Pass, where it all had started, they headed north 7 miles towards a waterfall-fed spring known as Indian Bread Rocks. And there, Ponce and Chia made smoke signals to let Cochise know they were there, and not to worry. But no response came back. Soon after the smoke, though, Chia sprang up from the camp, and he bolted up the mountain. He would not return. Instead, 2 young Apaches arrived with instructions to take the group up to finally see Cochise himself. The chief had been waiting for them for days. Chia was also up there waiting, too. He didn't bolt off and leave the group. Once in the Dragoon Mountains, that was Cochise's stronghold, they spent the night in a band leader named Taigi's rancheria. This rancheria was in a perfect Apache mountain stronghold, the archetype of them, really. The men were surrounded by Apaches and rocks, but Howard seemed to be at ease. Although he would note that the Apache leader, Taigi, he appeared gloomy and reserved. However, Howard noted that the children that gathered around the Anglos were happy and curious. Unfortunately for the crew, they wouldn't be seeing Cochise until the following day, which was October 1st, 1873. They were antsy. Lieutenant Sladen obviously got to witness firsthand this mountain stronghold fortress, which the Apache had been using since their original arrival into the American Southwest. Hutton writes of this and says, quote, "The lieutenant was amazed at the natural fortification they had entered. The village sat in the center of a 50-acre valley flanked on all sides by rocky bluffs some 400 feet high. Through its center ran a crystal-clear stream, and narrow canyon entrances marked both ends of the stronghold." End quote. It honestly sounds heavenly. No wonder the Apache did not want to give up their freedom to live on a reservation. A reservation down and out of their mountains. I wouldn't want to leave my mountain right now either. The following morning, while the group was eating a breakfast that Jeffords had prepared, a scene from a movie erupted. At first, a commotion had startled the party into looking up and over at a gathering crowd of Apaches. Then, Ponce began to say in Spanish, "He is coming! He is coming! He is coming!" He repeated it louder and louder, and eventually the entire little rancheria was chanting, "He is coming!" together. I will now let Hutton describe what happened next. An Apache, armed with a lance and wildly painted with black and vermilion, galloped straight at them, pulling his pony to a sudden halt, followed by a mounted party of 4. Quote, "It consisted of a fine-looking Indian, who rode up with great dignity, followed by a young man and 2 women." End quote. Noted Sladen. The man slowly dismounted and immediately embraced Jeffords. Taglito turned to Howard and said, "General, this is the man." Howard extended his hand, and Cochise shook it as he carefully studied the general. "Buenos dias," he said. Cochise then turned to Jeffords. "Will they do as they say they will?" he asked. "Well, I don't know," Taglito replied. "I think they will. But I will see that they do not promise too much." And all quotes. The historic meeting, the meeting so many before him had wanted and waited for, had finally arrived. With Cochise was his son Naiche, his wife, and his sister. And his sister was an important woman. Sladen would note that Cochise would consult with her regarding everything he said during this meeting. Eventually, after Jeffords and Cochise had talked for a bit, Cochise turned to Howard to begin the negotiations. Through Jeffords, who translated Apache straight to English, the first thing Cochise asked Howard was, "Why are you here?" He actually said in his very eloquent way, quote, "Will the general explain the object of his visit?" End quote. Howard responded that he was there on orders from the president to finally make peace between his white people and Cochise's Chokonin Apache. Cochise responded, quote, "No one wants peace more than I do." End quote. This was obviously fantastic news to Howard, but Howard knew the only way for there to be peace was if Cochise came in from the cold. So Howard asked him to please follow he and his men to Cañada Alamosa, where he and Victorio and Loco and all the Apaches, who so desired, could live there. Howard did have the authority to make new reservations, authority given to him by the president, but the Bureau and Congress still had to okay the plans in the end. And in the end, remember, the Bureau does not end up ever establishing a reservation again at Cañada Alamosa. But Howard doesn't know that yet, and peace is within his grasp. He and Cochise's grasp. So Howard had asked Cochise and his Chokonin to join the Chihini and Victorio at Cañada Alamosa. But Cochise, surprisingly, and against what Victorio had said, Cochise replied with, "No, I've never been there. Why don't you instead give me Apache Pass, the place where the cutting of the tent occurred? Not only will I be peaceful there, but I will guard the pass against the other Indian depredations." He said, quote, "I will see that nobody's property is taken by Indians." End quote. Howard really wanted Cochise to go to the non-existent Cañada Alamosa because that's where they could farm. There was no way they could practice agriculture in Apache Pass. Also, if the Apache were out of Arizona, they were safer from the Arizonans. Not that the South Central New Mexicans were much friendlier. But Howard also realized this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So he told Cochise, "Okay, I can make you a reservation right here in the Dragoon Mountains and the Chiricahua Mountains. I have full presidential authority to do so. How does that sound?" Cochise thought a moment before asking for 10 days. He wanted 10 days so that he may call in all of his warrior captains who were quote-unquote just making a living at the moment, aka they were raiding, mostly in Mexico. Howard agreed to the 10 days, and then he agreed, at Cochise's behest, he agreed that he would head to Fort Bowie to call in all of his soldiers so they wouldn't attack these warrior captains who were heading towards Cochise for this future meeting. Then a rather funny incident occurred when it was inferred that while Howard was gone, Jeffords and Sladen would stay. Howard, realizing that Sladen, who was already kind of terrified, Howard realized Sladen would therefore be a captive. So he objected to Sladen being forced to stay behind. He said, "No, Sladen can go, I will stay." But Cochise refused and told Howard that You, Howard, you're the boss, so you have to go. Howard again objected to Sladen being left behind, though. At this, Cochise said, quote, "Our young women will look after the young captain," end quote. Apparently, all the Apache women in attendance clapped and laughed at this joke, and the tension left the air. But before Howard departed, Cochise made a small speech in which he outlined the entire reason any of this was happening in the first place. He said, quote, "We were once a large people covering these mountains. We lived well. We were at peace. One day my best friend Mengus was seized by an officer of the white men and treacherously killed. The worst place of all is Apache Pass. There, 5 Indians, one my brother, were murdered. Their bodies were hung up and kept there till they were skeletons." End quote. This, of course, was the cutting of the tent brought on by the kidnapping of the half-breed boy from southern Arizona. Although no one knew it at this time that Felix, the boy, Mickey Free, the scout, and the coyote were all one and the same. And not to correct Cochise, but as Roberts points out, 6 Indians had been killed on that day of the cutting of the tent. But Cochise continued, quote, "Now Americans and Mexicans kill an Apache on sight. I have retaliated with all my might. My people have killed Americans and Mexicans and taken their property. Their losses have been greater than mine. I have killed 10 white men for every Indian slain. But I know that the whites are many and the Indians are few. Why shut me up on a reservation? We will make peace. We will keep it faithfully. But let us go around free as Americans do. Let us go wherever we please." End quote. This plea would fall on deaf ears, of course. The Indians, until their full assimilation, were to stay on the reservations where they would cultivate, capitalize, and Christianize. But again, there's the theme of endless white men and limited Indian. It is key, and it is the reason the Indian wars eventually cease. After Howard left to go call in his soldiers, Cochise attempted to calm Sladen by promising that, quote, "I will send off and get some tiswin, and we will all get drunk and have a good time tonight." End quote. Later, Sladen will write of tiswin, quote, "It seemed a harmless beverage and was a refreshing drink, sweet and pleasant to the taste, reminding me of the pop of my childhood." End quote. As Hutton writes, though, quote, "Of course, this fermented corn beverage had considerably more bite than soda pop." End quote. And historically, tiswin benders are often the cause of considerable more damage and death than Coca-Cola benders. During this time of pleasant imprisonment, Sladen would participate in the Apaches' dances. He'd admire the beauty of their women. He developed a taste for mezcal with mesquite beans. He also enjoyed horse meat, which I admit I do as well. Although at first Sladen did not like the horse, and he told Cochise he would rather prefer some pronghorn, to which Cochise apparently went out hunting and got Sladen one. At night, Sladen shared his campsite with Cochise's son Naiche, who would also attempt to teach Sladen some Apache language. Sladen and Tom Jeffords would also become friends at this time, and the group, Jeffords, Sladen, and Cochise, would spend a lot of time sitting on a rock, which was the roof of the stone alcove that Cochise was forced to sleep in. This area is now known as West Stronghold Canyon. At one point, though, Cochise took Sladen to an important vantage point in his Dragoon Mountains, where far below, a driver named Buckskin Alex, he was carrying the mail between Fort Bowie and the city of Tucson. Cochise then told Sladen that essentially, "I could kill this man right now if I wanted to, But I don't want to. Because if I do, the entire U.S. Army would come after me and avenge the destruction of this quote-unquote government cart. Earlier, before this interaction, Cochise had taken the man, Sladen, to a different lookout point where Sladen could see by the dust of the troopers, or actually Cochise could see by the dust of the troopers, he could tell when they left Fort Bowie. Cochise always had a 2-day advance knowledge of the Army's patrols. I guarantee you Sladen no doubt felt a little bit defeated. By October 4th, Howard had returned with a man named Streeter, and Streeter is another very interesting character that I talk about in the Jeffords episode. Along with Streeter, who was Jeffords' close friend, if Jeffords really had any of those besides Cochise, Howard also brought 3 others, as well as a wagon filled with corn, sugar, flour, coffee, and cloths for the women. During this time, Cochise, Sladen, Howard, and Jeffords would all spend considerable time together, and they would build trust amongst each other. 6 days later, on October 10th, still just over a month before the offensive would begin in Arizona, Cochise could wait no longer, and he finally called his meeting. The main person he was still waiting on was his eldest son, Taza, but he had not yet returned from a raid in Sonora. But the Grand Council with Howard must commence. Although the first part of the council that Cochise held saw Howard and the Anglos not invited. Obviously this worried the general, but Jeffords placated his fears and said that the Apache would let them know when they were ready to talk. And I'll just read Hutton for the remainder of the meeting. Quote, Howard paced back and forth as he listened to the muffled voices of the women as they slowly chanted louder and louder. Quote, Then all men and women sang with ever-increasing volume of sound, and the women's voices rose higher and higher, he tensely observed. It was a wild, weird performance. End quote. Then the call came for them to join the circle. They gathered under the shade of an expansive oak, circle upon circle, with Howard, Jeffords, and Sladen alongside Cochise and his important war chiefs. End all quotes. Howard also wrote of the scene, and I want to quote that as well because it sounds intense and awesome. He wrote, The men inside the ring sat or knelt. Then followed a wonderful song in which all joined. It began like the growl of a bear, and rising little by little to a high pitch, lasted 10 or more minutes, and then suddenly stopped. After this, Cochise interpreted to the people the will of the spirits, saying, The spirits have decided that Indians and white men shall eat bread together. End quote. So it was quite the scene, and during the scene, Jeffords and Cochise spoke often and intensely. And it was at this time that Howard realized how important Jeffords was to the entire operation. He was absolutely indispensable in keeping the peace with Cochise. Eventually, Howard agreed that Cochise could have a reservation in his own country, and that reservation's boundary would be the Arizona state line to the east, the Mexican border to the south, and it would include the Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, and Apache Pass. On top of that, the Army would feed and clothe the Apache, and most importantly, Jeffords would have to be the Indian agent. Howard turned to Jeffords and said, quote, Captain Jeffords, I cannot make peace unless you consent to act as Indian agent. End quote. Jeffords, he didn't mind taking the job, but he certainly didn't want it. And at first he did grumble that as a Democrat, he couldn't oblige to taking orders from a radical Republican. But sure, he'll do it. Although we did have some stipulations. First, the troops had to stay off the res and in Fort Bowie. Second, Jeffords would have complete and absolute authority. Surprisingly, Howard agreed to both of these demands. Cochise then declared, quote, "Hereafter the white man and the Indian are to drink of the same water and eat of the same bread." End quote. The treaty was made, and hopefully, peace would now reign in the American Southwest. Howard had succeeded so far, and it was truly somewhat of a miracle. Throughout this whole affair, though, for Sladen, Howard's aide, there was something bothering him. One of Cochise's warriors and confidants, Sladen couldn't help but notice he had some pretty significant sway over the Apache war chief. This Apache was interpreting Cochise's words from Apache into Spanish, although occasionally, Cochise, who spoke even better Spanish than this strange interpreter, Cochise would sometimes correct this man. Sladen described the man, this interpreter, and wrote, quote, "His sensual, cruel, crafty face, as well as his dissatisfied manner, had prejudiced me against him from the first." End quote. Sladen also called him a dangerous-looking man. Sladen simply could not shake the feeling that this Apache gave him. On top of his demeanor, the Apache was wearing a very fine and white man's white shirt with eyelets instead of buttons. Sladen realized this was an expensive shirt and not one that the Apache would be able to find at a trading post, and it certainly wasn't a ration. So Sladen inched closer to this scary man, and just as the meeting ended and the treaty had been finalized, Sladen saw a word, a name written on the bottom of this Apache man's shirt. That name read Cushing, the man who had been killed by Ho and Geronimo. Cushing had been the highest-ranking army commander the Apaches would kill in this long war. Sladen had unknowingly been introduced to the star of our next episode, a man I have talked about before when he lost his family in Mexico to treachery. That man is Goyakla, the Bedonkihi Apache medicine man, a man the Mexicans named after St. Jerome. Sladen had met Geronimo. After 11 years of war, it seemed Cochise had finally had enough. The old war chief agreed to the unthinkable. He and his people were going to settle down on a reservation. Obviously, the local Arizona papers were none too pleased that they got their own spot, this huge, vast land. They chastised Howard for giving in to the old chief and giving him a reservation in Arizona instead of New Mexico. Crook was disappointed that he couldn't go after Cochise himself in his upcoming campaign, since Howard had just made peace, but he figured it wouldn't be too long before Cochise was back on the warpath again. But, Crook was about to embark on his campaign I discussed at length, so for the time being he was a little preoccupied. But there was something I hinted at earlier that pretty much only a few Apache and one white man knew. That one white man being Jeffords. But Cochise was in complete and constant physical agony. Most of the pain emanated from his stomach, and it only got worse when he ate or drank. Occasionally he'd go days with only putting water in his stomach. And every day the pain got worse. Cochise was growing weaker. His own body was killing him. But Crook did not know this piece of information, and he was still convinced that the wily old warrior chief would one day start his troubles anew. Crook said of this very Apache tactic, quote, "The mere fact of their not having deprecated on our people proves nothing, as it is Apache tactics after they have thoroughly aroused the neighborhood by their depredations to cease operations in that locality until the unwary citizen is thrown off his guard, when they commence their outrages with renewed vigor." End quote. It had indeed happened before, many times, for hundreds of years, as y'all have heard. So Crook decided to send Bourke to meet with Cochise. In December of 1872, During the massive offensive, the United States government made the Chiricahua Reservation official. It was a 55-mile square tract of land in the southeast corner of Arizona, which included the Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, Dos Cabezas, Apache Pass, and was noted by the Apache as being the most perfect reservation ever created for the American Indian. There were springs, antelope, deer, canyons, and the only wide-eyes building in the whole reservation was a trading post at Sulphur Springs and the barely manned Fort Bowie. And that sits northwest of the Chiricahua National Monument, today's Chiricahua National Monument, which is an incredibly beautiful place. Crook really didn't like that Howard had been able to just create a reservation on the fly, especially one for the deadly murderer Cochise. Howard had not even bothered to write anything about the arrangement down. He had just assumed that Cochise would keep his word. Crook believed the Apache only relented after they'd been soundly defeated in battle. He believed Cochise would rise again. Then there's the whole matter of the Army not being allowed to enter the reservation. A reservation which was ran by one single man, a man who didn't want the job in the first place, and a man that most white eyes didn't really trust. And that man is Tom Jeffords. So in February of 1873, Crook sent Bourke and a delegation to meet with Cochise. One of the things Crook wanted to know was how much was Cochise raiding into Mexico. Because if he was leaving the reservation, maybe Crook had a reason to end the whole thing. When Bourke asked the old chief, Cochise responded with the fact that the Mexicans, quote, had not asked him for peace as the Americans had, end quote. That was a quote from Bourke. And while that's true, it's kind of funny. Like, yeah, I made peace with y'all, but my boundary is the border with Mexico, and I can go down there if I want to. I'm still at war with them, remember? I mean, maybe not he himself. He did later in the conversation admit that, yeah, okay, my young warriors are, quote, liable to go down from time to time and do a little damage to the Mexicans. I don't want to lie about this thing. They go, but I don't send them, end quote. I really love the way that Cochise speaks. With that answer, Bourke was forced to tell Crook that, hey, we can't do anything about the Apaches. So Crook was forced to leave Cochise alone. In reality, though, Cochise kept his word. I mean, right up until he died. The depredations, murders, burnings, torture, it had all slowly ceased until Apache violence in Arizona was almost non-existent. The Arizona press, once critical of Howard and Tom Jeffords, were now praising their actions. Jeffords really was the best and most lenient Indian agent to have ever Indian agented. I'll get into the San Carlos Reservation in the next episode, but those Apache had to wear brass tags, I like identifying them. They could not leave the reservation. It was a tough life. Here at the Chiricahua Reservation, life was easy, life was free. No tags, no daily head count. Jeffords would, instead of calling the Indians to him for rations on ration day, Tom Jeffords would travel the landscape and hand out rations to each individual family and band. He did not even force them to farm. And they got to camp and live and travel wherever they wanted to on the entire reservation. When Bourke visited the reservation, he noted that these Chiricahua Apache called the Apache at the San Carlos Reservation. The Chiricahua called them squaws. They said those Apache had to work like women. For this, the Apache at San Carlos came to hate the Chiricahuas and their freedom. Crook hated their freedom too, and he would try over and over again to take possession of the reservation from Jeffords. Jeffords would counter with, "If you enforce San Carlos laws and rules here, Cochise and his Chiricahua will bounce. And then they'll commence their war against you and the people of Arizona and New Mexico. No one will be safe. You will be blamed." So Crook had to relent. This problem of the Chiricahua under Cochise continuing to raid into Mexico, though, that really was a point of contention, and it really did nearly destroy the already ill-fated reservation even sooner than it was already doomed. So if you've made it this far into the series, you know how strong the hatred of the Apaches is towards the Mexicans. I probably could have had a couple more episodes, at least one more episode, over the Spanish and Mexicans, if I spoke Spanish more competently, or read it more competently, I should say. The two really hated each other, more than I have described or could describe. For instance, here is a great story about how Cochise himself felt about the Mexicans. In March of 1873, Cochise, fairly ill at this time, with not many more sunrises left in him, he headed to Apache Pass for the very first time since the cutting of the tent 11 years earlier. Once there, he and his 20 mounted warriors were met by the army and the chief of scouts, Merejildo Grijalva. Grijalva, remember, was Mexican. Sure, he'd been kidnapped and raised as a Chiricahua, and he had met Cochise many years before, but still, he was a Mexican. And Roberts sums up what happened next between Cochise and this quite competent chief of scouts. Quote, "Before the chief had dismounted, Grijalva offered Cochise his hand. But, said a witness, now quoting the witness, Cochise told him he would not shake hands with him until he whipped him. So he got down, off from his horse, and struck him 2 or 3 times with his whip, and then they had a friendly embrace, and commenced to talk over old times." End all quotes. I mean, the two knew each other, but still, Cochise had to whip the Mexican before he would even talk to him. And then, a year later, just before his death, Cochise met a Mexican man, a trader, who had come up from Sonora with 20 Mexican soldiers. They had come up from Sonora onto the Chiricahua Reservation. This trader was there because he wanted to see if he could trade goods to the skeleton crew of American soldiers who manned Fort Bowie. Now, obviously, before he could make this happen, he had to have Cochise's blessing. So at the fort, Cochise met with this Mexican trader, and to translate from Apache to Spanish, even though Cochise spoke very good Spanish, Cochise used Grijalva. Cochise then told this brave but foolish Mexican trader, in one heck of an angry tirade, quote, "You come in here and ask to make a treaty with me and to cross my reservation with your wagons and goods. You forget what the Mexicans did to my people long ago when we were at peace with the Americans. And you would get my people down into your country, get them drunk on mezcal, and furnish them with powder and lead and tell them to come up and get the big mules from the Americans. And when they would commit a depredation and steal mules and bring them back to your country, your people would get them drunk on mezcal and cheat them out of their mules. You've got 20 soldiers. And what do they amount to? I can take 5 of my men and wipe them off the earth." End quote. That kind of reminds me, do you feel in charge? It seems like this may have been personal. It kind of seems like Cochise knows this trader specifically, and he's referencing a very specific incident. And Cochise is appalled that this man is coming up here to ask him after he cheated his people, Cochise's own people. And this next anecdote, or the anecdote to end this story, kind of backs up my claim that it was personal. Because after he said this tirade, one of Cochise's warriors raised his rifle to shoot this Mexican dead on the spot. But Cochise, he waved his hand at the warrior, who understood the command, as all Apache did. He lowered the rifle and began to weep out of anger and frustration at not being able to kill this Mexican. If you've been to Southeast Arizona, which I hope you have, and I implore all of my listeners to check it out if you have not, but if you've been to the ruins of Fort Bowie, or the grandeur of the Chiricahua Mountains, or the charming beauty of Portal, you know there is no such thing as a Chiricahua Apache reservation. And well, that is because it was just not meant to last. Over in Washington, there was something going on I had no clue about, but it involved our favorite unelected bureaucrats and their slow destruction, that is still going on, of our once stable, elected government. Here is Roberts describing this fight in D.C. Quote, "The fault lay almost entirely in Washington. The Department of Interior, under whose aegis the Bureau of Indian Affairs operated, had launched a power struggle with the Department of War over control of the reservations. The feud would last a decade and a half and cause untold damage, bewildering the Apaches who were caught in the crossfire." End quote. One of these unelected bureaucrats was named Francis A. Walker, and his lecherous title was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Walker was the most managerial man of all of the managerial class, before the managerial elite even existed. He would be the envy of the progressive politician today. Actually, no, they're not competent enough. So he was no doubt like the envy of a new dealer. Anyways, Walker demanded that Jeffords keep, starting now, intricate and extremely petty details of all the goings-on at the reservation. This was something Jeffords was just not want to do. He didn't want the position in the first place, remember? Now he had to write everything down like a boob. When Jeffords said he wasn't going to do that, but he still needed money and supplies, Walker responded with, according to Roberts, quote, "red tape, legalisms, or silence." End quote. See what I mean? This is just not how men should act, especially men in power, even if they didn't earn it. Oftentimes, Jeffords had to pay for meat and rations out of his own pocket. D.C. was that petty and gross. Still is. When Jeffords couldn't afford the food, and the Indian Affairs didn't provide the food the Apache needed to survive, how do you think they responded? Of course, they raided down into Mexico. I mean, how else were they going to eat? After all, these Chiricahua were not being forced to grow their own food. But even if they had wanted to, this reservation did not have enough arable land with the tools and machinery they had at this time to make it work. And that was actually another point of contention between Jeffords and this pathetic Walker. Walker told Jeffords that you must force the Apache to farm or else. They were also no longer allowed to roam their own reservation. No, sir. Like Crook, Walker wanted them settled down, preferably within a mile of the reservation's agency. Meanwhile, because there weren't many great spots, Jeffords had chosen and abandoned by late 1873 3 separate spots for his agency. How could he force the Apache to settle near the agency when he couldn't settle the agency himself? Fed up with taking orders from progressive Republicans in a job he didn't want in the first place, Jeffords telegraphed his resignation at the end of 1873. But like the unmanly bureaucrat he was, Walker never accepted, rejected, or even acknowledged he ever even received the request. At least Carleton had been man enough to tear up Kit Carson's resignation in front of the man. By 1874, neither the Chiricahua Reservation nor Cochise were long for this world. Either colon or stomach cancer was eating the warrior chief from the inside, and by the spring of 74, he was almost daily drunk on Tiswin or whiskey. It was the only thing that took away the constant and immense pain. It was probably also accelerating his doom. Taza, Cochise's eldest son and soon-to-be chief, felt this whole affair was on account of a witch. And you know what? There was an old man they knew who had recently visited Cochise, and he must have been the culprit who had cursed his dying father. So Taza led some warriors into the mountains to find the man, and when they did, they were going to bring him back to Cochise and burn him alive. I mean, they thought that would surely fix the dying old man. But thankfully, I guess for this old man at least, Jeffords intercepted the crew and forced them to release the possible witch. Jeffords knew that Cochise was suffering from within, not from magic without. On June 7th, 1874, Tom Jeffords would meet with Cochise for the final time. Whatever was killing Cochise was about to win. Recently, the old chief had made sure everyone would follow his oldest son, Taza, once the time came for him to go to the happy place. He also made sure they were going to remain peaceful with the White Eyes. He demanded it of his people, especially his two sons, Naiche and Taza. But everyone, right now, was on board. Cochise asked his old white friend during this final visit, quote, "Do you think you will ever see me alive again?" Jeffords responded with, "No, I do not think I will. I think that by tomorrow night you will be dead." "Yes, I think so too," said Cochise, and then he added, "Do you think we will ever meet again?" Jeffords thought for a moment and then responded with, "I don't know. What is your opinion about it?" Cochise said, "I have been thinking a good deal about it while I have been sick here, and I believe we will. Good friends will meet again, up there." With that, he pointed towards the heavens and the seemingly endless twinkling Arizona stars. Hutton sums up what happened next on June 8th, 1874. Quote, "The next morning he was dead. A great wail went up from every voice in the East Stronghold, then across the Dragoon Mountains, and soon throughout all of Apacheria. It kept up all day and all night. Cochise's wife and sister prepared him for burial. They washed him, carefully combed his long hair, and placed a majestic feathered bonnet on his head. They painted his face for war, then wrapped his now frail body in a splendid red woolen blanket. That afternoon, a sad procession made its way deep up into the towering rocks of the stronghold. The two sons of Cochise, Taza and Naiche, led Cochise's horse upon which the body had been placed, followed by the chief's 3 wives, a shaman, and Jeffords. Cochise's faithful dog walked alongside the horse. Behind them, hundreds of Chokonen people followed. They carried many of their belongings with them to burn over the chief's grave. They took him high up amid the great rocks where a deep chasm existed. The horse was killed and rolled in, followed by his dog, then his weapons, and finally the body of Cochise was lowered by ropes into a final place of rest. A fire now consumed the clothing and property of the great chief, and then dark smoke rose above the stronghold along with their cries of lamentation. The greatest of the lords of Apacheria was no more. End quote. It is reported that the warriors who buried him also shot 2 more horses and placed them at strategic locations which would assist him in the happy place. The ceremony of mourning lasted 4 days, a time period reserved only for great Apache men. Jeffords' assistant would write that, quote, "The howl that went up from these people was fearful to listen to. They scattered around in the nooks and ravines in parties, and as the howling from one rancheria would lag, it would be renewed with vigor in another. This was kept up through the night and until daylight next morning." End quote. So Doug Hawking's book, Tom Jeffords, Friend of Cochise, which I used in the subscriber-only episode, Hawking said that Tom was actually away giving rations. He did not return until after the funeral. So a whole bunch of other sources said he was there. Edit. And Jeffords let people think that, because that's just kind of the way he was. So no one but Apaches have been at the burial. But it is very likely that Tom was later shown or told where the burial was. Regardless of if he ever visited the site or not, Tom Jeffords would never tell a soul where Cochise's final resting place resided. In the next episode, the reservations at Tularosa and in the Chiricahua Mountains will end. And Geronimo and Victorio and Nana will wage an all-out war against the Americans and the Mexicans for their freedom. All of them will be ill-fated wars that will see many veterans of the series so far, as well as many newcomers appear. Victorio will describe the coming conflict as, quote, "From now on it will be war. War to the death." Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest. If you are not already a subscriber, head on over to the website, theamericansouthwest.com, or my Substack, The American Southwest, and sign up to be a Roadrunner. There are tons of exclusive episodes and goodies that'll come your way.